Welcome everyone to this research event organized by York St. John University. So my name is Dr. Ernestine Leonze, and I am joined by fantastic colleagues and people working on things that has to do with fatherhood. So the event is about so like the title, Fatherhood 2022, we really turning our focus on fathers. So the focus is on fathers. So I'm joined by my colleagues, like I said, and I'm just going to let them introduce themselves. And I'm going to start with, I'm following my screen in no particular order, but I'm following my screen. I'm going to start with Rachel, please.
Hi, nice to meet you. My name's Rachel Richaksono, and I'm head of the School of Education, Language and Psychology, which includes some of my dear colleagues who will be speaking at this event today at York St. John University, and I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Paige, please.
Hi, I'm Dr. Paige E Davis. I'm a senior lecturer here at York St. John, or here at my house, but here at York St. John. I have been working as one of the leads on the Parent Center for the last year and a half. And I look at transition to parenthood, breastfeeding, and I've been looking at fathers recently.
Thank you, Paige. Sammy, please.
Hi, I'm Sammy Shaw. I'm a doctoral trainee at York St. John, and I'm doing my thesis on dads. So I'll be presenting that today. Very excited.
Thank you, Sammy. Lynn, please. You're on mute, please.
Hi, I'm Lynn Gabriel, and I have the great pleasure to work with people like Ernestine and Paige and Rachel, and lovely to meet new people here today, and parents and professionals and others who are here for this great event.
Thank you, Lynn. Scott?
I'm muting myself. Yes, good morning. My name's Scott Mayer. I'll be presenting later on, talking about the importance of having more of an understanding in fathers' mental health and the impact that it has, and how we can factor in fathers as a better outcome for the child's development. I work training in fathers' mental health and peer supporting new fathers. So everything I talk about comes from the fathers that I speak to. Very honoured to be here.
Thank you very much, Scott. We also have Dr. Andrew Mayers, who will be joining us later, and he works, most of his work is on perinatal mental health, and he'll be joining us a little later. So the program, we're going to start now, but there are presentations all through the day. So we're starting now to finish at 2 o'clock. There will be a break at 12 o'clock. We'll have a break for half an hour, and then we will reconvene to continue with the discussions. So to start, I'm going to hand over to Rachel. Rachel is going to basically introduce and welcome everybody, and then we will hand over to Lynn and we will just start the day. Rachel, please.
Thank you very much, Ernestine, and thank you for this invitation to open the conference. It's a real honour. As I said earlier, my job here, part of my job, is to head up the School of Education, Language and Psychology at York St. John University, and it's a diverse school with those 3 disciplines and some others in it, which I very much enjoy working in because of the cross-disciplinary work that the school facilitates. And although Ernestine is in a different part of the university, in a different academic school, we're also pretty good, I think, I hope Ernestine will agree, at working together across schools. And you'll see examples of that cross-disciplinary work that we do here at York St. John. And it's important because the kind of issues, problems, gaps that we care about at York St. John are often complicated, and require a cross-disciplinary working in order to collaborate on understanding what those issues are, and then co-create and then evaluate potential solutions to those problems. So cross-disciplinary working, and here today from the School of Education, Language and Psychology, we have Dr. Paige Davis from Psychology and Professor Lynn Gabriel from the counselling team. So that cross-disciplinary working is very important. It's essential, I think, if we're going to move forward in our understanding and then proposal of solutions for these complicated problems that we're all interested in. So I'm glad to be here representing a diverse school with diverse disciplinary perspectives. And yeah, as I say, across the whole university. We are at York St John. We were set up in 1841 to provide a school, a middle school, and also teacher training for school teachers across York. So we've always been activist scholars at York St John. So while we work together to get a collaborative understanding, and in the beginning at York St John, it was an understanding with pupils and teachers working together to understand their situation in York and beyond. We work to get a collaborative understanding of issues. We want to do something. We want to do something about what next. How can we make things better? How can we improve people's lives? How can we better understand what's going on? So that next step, that so what step, is very important to us. We're a set of activist scholars, and you'll hear that coming through very strongly in the work, in the research and the community engaged work that you hear about today. And when I finish speaking, I'll hand over to our Professor Lynn Gabriel, who will perhaps say something about our very new and very exciting York St John University Communities Centre. And that's something that Ernestine, Paige, Lynn and I and other colleagues across the university have been working on now so hard for a number of years, and we're really delighted to have secured some premises, which you'll hear more about perhaps during the day, and certainly as the year progresses and we open up that communities centre to provide research informed services for the community, including some that I'm sure that Paige, for example, will talk about, and also Lynn. And this is part of our work as a university. The job of the university is to create and disseminate new knowledge, and we do that in collaboration with our own students and with the participants in our research. So the Communities Centre will provide an opportunity for placements for our students and research opportunities for students and staff. So we're really delighted as activist scholars to have this opportunity to work in and through the York St John Communities Centre. It's really exciting development. So keep your eyes and ears open for news about that, and we hope to welcome you in person at a series of events that we have planned to open up that community centre later this year. After this session, at 11 o'clock I'm teaching a class, so I'll hear the first part of the conference and then go to teach a class. And the class that I'm teaching is a master's class in my academic discipline, which is linguistics, specifically applied linguistics. And the session we're doing is about interviews as a research method for eliciting stories from the participants in our research. And I had the pleasure of hearing from Scott earlier when we were introducing ourselves privately, and I heard a little bit about Scott's amazing story, and hopefully he will share that later today. I'm really committed to the idea of hearing stories and of actively facilitating storytelling and listening to those stories And I'm committed to that as an activist activity. The session that I'm teaching at 11 o'clock is based on a research project that I did here at York St John with a student. It was a master's student who did a master's by research. So she wrote a 30,000 word thesis, which was about eliciting hidden stories, whatever we mean by hidden to whom, around the city of York. And that was published as a book subsequent to her successful examination called York's Hidden Stories, Interviews in Applied Linguistics. And we just finished that book at the beginning of 2020 and sent it off to the publisher. So it's still fairly new. And when I go and teach my students this afternoon, I'm going to read out the last paragraph of the book, and I'm going to finish my introductory remarks with the same paragraph, and I hope it will resonate with you around the importance of hearing people's stories, actively eliciting those stories, and then using those stories as a springboard to co-construct solutions to the problems that those stories surface. So if you just bear with me, I'll read the last paragraph of that book, York's Hidden Stories. So here we go. This is me and my ex-student, Dasha Zhuravskaya, originally from Belarus, writing this last paragraph in 2020. Here we go. We're writing the last chapter of this book during the isolating experience of lockdown, when the opportunity to tell our stories is limited by the need to stay at home. New ways of creating our identities online are already available, and we look forward to exploring how these, in addition to the more familiar face-to-face activities, can be used to unhide the worlds of those who may previously have been hidden. However, we are also writing against a backdrop of political unrest in Belarus, where there is a popular protest against the president, who has been in power since 1994. These protests began with a blogger, Serhiy Tikhanovsky, who started traveling around Belarus, collecting stories from people that were unheard of on state TV. Tikhanovsky and other opposition candidates have gained strong support from the people who are watching their stories on the internet. However, those stories were unpopular with the current government, who in due course jailed the blogger, his team, and other opposition candidates. Throughout this book, we have focused on the positive aspects of storytelling and how stories can unhide hidden aspects of people's lives. However, as the example of the Belarusian blogger shows, stories can also be suppressed and storytellers silenced. Unfortunately, some people are prepared to go a long way to stop other people from telling their stories. Fortunately, there are other people who are prepared to go an even longer way to continue telling their stories. We are listening. And that was the end of our book. So I'm delighted and, as I say, honoured to be here to hear some of those stories as ways of not only understanding but working together on the collaboration and co-creation of solutions through our research with our students and through the York St John Community Centre. It's really important work that everyone here is doing, and I'm very, very, very proud to be able to do whatever I can to support it. So please go on, tell your stories and continue to collaborate. Thank you very much, Ernestine. It's an honour to be invited. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And I can see from the chat how much people are appreciating that quote, that paragraph you've just read, and they're asking for details. So if you have the details of the book and all that, if you can, please put that in the chat. And thank you so much. Thank you. So just one thing as we go along, if people have contributions, comments to make, they can make it in the chat. If people have questions that we need to pick up on, can you please use the Q&A to ask the questions, please? Thank you. So we're going to now ask Professor Lynn Gabriel to talk about the project and where we're coming from, how we got to here, and what really are we driving at. Lynn, please.
Thank you, Ernestine and Paige. I'm really delighted to be here and enjoying seeing other people, meeting other people, and hearing Ernestine speak, and I'll hear Paige speak, and also hearing Rachel speak. Great. Well, to parents, to professionals and academics who work with families, and to everyone joining us today, it's great to have you with us and to be hearing about some incredible work that's been going on, including Samantha's research work as a doctoral candidate at York St John. No doubt you're going to enjoy this event, hopefully make some new connections, perhaps reconnect with people you know already, and make some new colleagues. Ernestine Gayo NZ and Paige Davis approached me through Rachel quite some time ago, about 2 years ago, and I was delighted to meet them, and both became involved in something that Rachel's alluded to. We set up a steering group, and both Ernestine and Paige were key players in that steering group and really pitching for a parent stroke family centre. And for me, it was just an obvious had to happen. So it's great to be working with both. Their projects are innovative, they're novel, and they're making a difference. I have seen some of the things on social media that are said about the work, particularly some of Ernestine's recent work with dads. Paige and Ernestine are inspirational women who hosted the first Parenthood event in 21. And it's lovely to be celebrating and showcasing their work, Samantha's work, and other people's work. So colleagues like Andrew and Scott and others who are here today. They're really important colleagues, Paige and Ernestine, at York St John, and they're part of something that Rachel's already commented on, a thriving interdisciplinary, when I speak correctly, community, which is both an internal facing community at York St John and also an external facing. So we do lots of work in different communities, both local, national, regional, national, and on an international level. So we're all connected to York St John Community Centre. Rachel mentioned that earlier. As we speak, the refurbishment on 32 to 34 Clarence Street is happening, and look out for signals, as Rachel also said, for the opening of the community centre. It's going to be a lovely space, and we would welcome you to come along and have a look and engage with us. The centre currently works on different parts of the campus, and we work both in person and through online services. So both Paige runs a group in a lovely part of the chapel, which is based on campus, and Ernestine uses rooms in campus for some of her dad's work. So we do have space on campus, but we're actually really excited about what will be there in Clarence Street. And Paige and Ernestine will have a room that they have first call on for their parent families work, lovely big room based on the ground floor of the centre. So you'd be very welcome to come and have a cuppa and have a look around. So we work with individuals, we work with groups, we've got a very large Facebook group, a close Facebook group for people who've been bereaved during the pandemic, and that has hundreds of individuals involved. And we run online bereavement support groups and a range of other things to support people who've lost loved ones and struggled during the pandemic, and that affects all, parents, babies, families, all of us. we are really keen, and I know Ernestine and Paige will talk about this, but we're really keen. So we are a community centre, and it's what it says on the tin. However, what's important in that community and the communities is that we work with interdisciplinary colleagues and also with colleagues and citizens in the region, in the area, in York, to undertake our work and also to undertake evidence-based practice and to be researching our work. So you'll hear more from, particularly from Samantha and Paige and Ernestine and Scott. We are, I loved what Rachel was saying, we are definitely academic, practical, and actually increasingly political activists based in York St John. And one example of that is a Ukraine summit that we were involved in as a centre. So a summit for people who work with mental health, looking at psychological therapies for people who are struggling and what can that bring to support people. We had with us, joining us online in a really powerful and compelling period of the conference, people coming direct from Kiev and from Lviv, and they certainly made their mark and had many people in tears and talking about babies, families, birthing, protecting people in what's happening in Ukraine. And I know we can relate to that, particularly those here who work with parents with new infants, children. It's powerful and it's incredibly disturbing. Moving on, Ernestine and Paige are building a parents' family centre and associated projects, and their presence is being felt in York, and I can only see it growing and extending. And they will be key players in the Clarence Street premises. Parents' needs and voices will inform the ongoing development of their projects and what happens for families through the centre. I know that Ernestine and Paige are very keen to enhance and improve the parent experience in York and build evidence-based practice to inform that. We hope that you enjoy today because it covers so much: workplace support, breastfeeding projects, dad's mental health, father's mental health, and so much more. And it's lovely to see in our colleagues who are attending, we've got a perinatal psychologist with us, so that's great. I'm sure you'll gain a lot and give a lot in today along with everybody else. Lots of opportunity for discussion, for interaction, for listening, for dialogue, for critique. And I have no doubt that this event, organised by Ernestine and Paige, will inspire ongoing work and new possibilities, both for the Parenthood programmes and for the ongoing footprint and impact of the community centre and York St John. So without further ado, I'm going to go quiet and pass over to your hosts, Ernestine and Paige. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lynn, for all those nice words. But I think Paige and I, if I speak on behalf of Paige and myself, we would not have gone anywhere with it if we didn't have the strong support from both you and Rachel. So thank you so much. So without wasting any more time, we're going to start our first presentation of the day, which will be delivered by Paige. And the title is "What Works for Moms Doesn't Work for Dads." It's a qualitative analysis of the Parenthood event we had in 2021. So Paige, please.
Hi, I'm gonna share my screen. Okay, so I'm Dr. Paige Davis. I have introduced myself already, so I'll just go on and talk to you about what I'm going to look at and what I have looked at from last year's Parenthood 2021. I labeled it "What Works for Moms Doesn't Work for Dads." It was a quote from a practitioner talking about how to engage dads. And the qualitative analysis really sets the stage for why we decided to focus more on dads this year. And we started with this project that we were focusing on all different parents, and we were trying to inform the opening of this center. So we've turned this into a paper that will be going under review pretty soon. And hopefully it will inform researchers, at least, as to what we can do in order to change the parenthood experience a little bit and make it a little bit better and easier. So basically, we all know that new parenthood is this critical transition period, and there are all of these unmet needs of parents. And despite having all this support, or despite having less support rather, parents are adjusting to all of these different new types of responsibilities, relationship changes, and identities. So all of a sudden you have to take care of a new infant and make sure it doesn't die. Like, it's a pretty incredible responsibility. And you have these relationship changes where you usually take care of your partner, but actually you have less resources to take care of your partner now. You're concentrating on taking care of someone else, and really yourself sometimes only. And then with your identity, so I don't know about any of you that are parents, but I went from being Paige and I turned into being Fisher's mom or West's mom. So that whole identity shift. And so we know that there are lots of different ways people can find support. Parents can find support via family, friends, government programs. All of these ways we find support. But support is one of the most well-researched areas of parenthood. You know, some people have a ton of support, some people have less. There's all of these varying amounts of support that people have or feel they have. And actually mental health and the psychological experience of, you know, whether they're mentally healthy or not, relates to the type of support parents have said that they've received. So we know that support's really important, not just that you know, we should be providing it or that it's there. And there are many calls in the research for these more nuanced approaches to support. So you have all of these diverse needs of different parents, and, you know, one model doesn't fit every parent, just as, you know, what works for moms doesn't work for dads, or maybe it does for some dads, right? So I had another practitioner saying, you know, some dads want to be lads and they want to kind of talk together as lads, and some just want to go with their partner and go to therapy. And so, you know, these are just really diverse needs that new parents have. And we do know that there are some prevention services in New York, and there are also there's also this interplay between the universal services, other systems of support. So we have all of this different research on support. We know that parents are asking for more support. We know that between pregnancy and postpartum, support differs so drastically. You get all of this support as a mother, but not a father necessarily during pregnancy, but postpartum, there's way less for both mothers and fathers. So then the reason why we ended up here at Parenthood 2021 was, as Lynn had said, we were trying to really inform the center's opening. We have a lot of different ideas as to how this center is going to look, but we wanted to know where gaps in provisions were. We wanted to know where people in New York wanted services. So what we did was we set up a public engagement event. And so that was the first goal of the public engagement event. The second goal was really to produce a paper, the paper that we're going to send out for review, that's based on what we found about the services that parents want. So in doing this and in looking at the Parent Center and the opening of it, we really aimed to have these interrelated areas of holistic family support. So we wanted a real holistic view. So my area was going to be, or is infant feeding and breastfeeding. So we had infant feeding and family health, mental health support for family well-being, and then looking at leave and return to work for family choices. And the goal is to kind of make this center where you have this holistic view. And interestingly enough, last week, I was talking to people that were coming for breastfeeding support, and they both said, well, we're having some issues with coming back to work. And I said, well, wait, right after the breastfeeding support group, Ernestine is available for legal advice. So they went right after the breastfeeding support, and they went, and Ernestine had conversations with both of them, and gave them information for what their next step would be. So it's really a holistic viewpoint that we're looking at here. There we go. So on February 22nd in 2021, we had 3 separate Zoom sessions to inform this opening and this paper. So we looked at new parents of 0 to 3-year-olds. We thought 0 to 3, at least even if you had a 3-year-old, you would still remember back in those early days. We looked at professionals working with new parents, and we looked at academics studying parenthood, or researchers, because it wasn't all academics, some were researchers. And so we first presented the Parent and Family Center to the public. There were 57 participants. We had 10 breakout focus groups using breakout rooms where different facilitators would talk to the different participants. They'd ask them this semi-structured, we had a semi-structured questionnaire. Sadly, only 6 groups and 29 participants were retained, but thank goodness that was enough to actually look at what themes were. So when initially, we listened to the focus groups and came up with these preliminary findings. And then finally we got the transcriptions and read the transcriptions, used the 6-step Braun and Clark method by identifying codes that were prevalent throughout the interview, or not the focus groups, and then looked at themes and cut some themes. Some themes we realized went inside other themes, and we came up with 3 main themes. The first one, sadly, was the pre versus post-COVID parenting. So this permeated all through every group. We looked at, and it was just that contrast between these pre and post-COVID parenting issues. Then we looked at pathways and barriers. We had pathways and barriers to support, so advantages and issues for new parents. This was the second theme. And then the third was the pressures of parenting. And some of these themes had sub-themes. The second one of the major sub-themes was that fathers. And then there were 3 topics which were pervasive because of our semi-structured questioning. So we asked specifically about things like breastfeeding, leave and return to work, and mental health, because that's what we were interested in. So the first thing that we found was with these, with this pre versus post-COVID needs was, there was this idea that technology was a double-edged sword. There were some really great things about technology and some things that were less great throughout COVID. There were also all of these ideas that new parents were saying, well, is it normally this way? Do all parents get treated this way with services? Or, you know, they weren't really sure because they hadn't had the experience. And then experienced parents, it was different. They knew that there was a big difference. And then there was an interesting, real positive spin on the ability to be uninterrupted by other members of the family, other people in the first few weeks, which I found really surprising. That, you know, I mean, I guess I shouldn't have, because I'm a parent myself and being uninterrupted would be great. But you know, there were these unexpected silver linings, and there were also unexpected disadvantages. I've put the extracts for silver linings here. So I'll start with a parent. With my second, I was afforded the peace and quiet of lockdown, so people couldn't come. That was that not having to share your baby in the first couple weeks. And a lot of the practitioners were saying, you know, learning your baby in those first couple days can be really tough. And, you know, instinctively kind of that, you know, you want to be close to them, and giving them away to someone to hold for 5 minutes may seem like not a big deal to them, but to you, you know, or perhaps the double-edged sword also there is that you need a break. But they were looking at it as a really nice silver lining. And then the researcher saying, when you're doing the Zoom calls, the dad's there, he's holding the camera, you know, and he's getting involved, which is brilliant, which wasn't the case so much before, which I think also is this silver lining, that dads have been more available because of the whole change in that work. And Sammy, our doctoral student who's doing research, will talk a little bit more about this with masculinity. But and then they can go onto a Facebook group page, and they're guaranteed someone can give you some answers. So there's the technology there. But then there were also disadvantages. So not being the researcher over on the right of the screen, moms and dads haven't been properly supported. That was one of the big things that came up with practitioners, parents, and researchers. And then with the dad saying, I was on my own, or mom saying, I was on my own, my husband wasn't there, he wasn't allowed in for he wasn't allowed in for only 2 hours a day, meaning that she didn't get to see her husband in the hospital after birth. So that was a big deal for both parents. And then a practitioner saying, some moms don't like to see themselves on the screen. For some people, it's a good thing. For some people, it's been more of a challenge. And I'll leave it there. So that was pre versus post COVID. Then we're going to get to the part where we started seeing. So as you can see, there was a lot having to do with dads, even in the pre versus post COVID. Now we'll get more into those pathways and barriers to support. So this was how the three groups of individuals really experienced the support they had or the lack thereof. And so the pervasive sub-theme was fathers having these barriers to support, and then lived experience as a pathway to support for both fathers and mothers. So, excuse me. The practitioner is saying, explaining there's so much support in this city, the practitioner is explaining that there's so much support in the city that actually they're competing with each other, saying, you know, we don't even know two different people are doing the exact same thing. They're competing with each other. They should just kind of either join together or be signposted better, things like that. And then having this disjointed support, every midwife had a different viewpoint, wanted to help me in a different way, and that was apparent. So here was the major kind of turning point where we went, okay, this is what we really need to focus on next time, because this was also a really big issue. There was a unanimous call from the group of participants, which was the theme of fathers not receiving support, and not receiving enough support, or just being forgotten. So it wasn't just unavailable. It was problem getting men to access support, or those who see themselves as fathers accessing that support. And what worked for mothers didn't really necessarily work for fathers. Like I said, the lads versus alone. So, so fathers also, we had some dads in the focus groups, and they often described feeling like they were just alone and not being able to support their partner in things like breastfeeding. They just kind of felt like they were on the sideline. They didn't know what to do. They were unable to help. And so one of the researchers talks about how they've started to look at parenthood as a teachable moment for not just the mothers, but for the partners as well. So fathers are starting to be looked at a little bit more in terms of that researcher's research. And he kind of closed up quickly and, oh, I can't talk about me because that's what we do. We don't talk about dad's feeling. So that's a practitioner talking about her experience with trying to get a dad to open up, and how this was just not something that he was used to doing or was told by society he should be doing. So, you know, we don't talk about dad's feelings. We talk about mom's feelings. And then a parent saying, as a partner, I wasn't able to share the experiences. We weren't told about this. So that's a dad actually talking. So he didn't feel ready. He didn't feel like he was told that he couldn't share that experience. And then the other theme was this support pathways being, providing parents with these lived experience practitioners, some people call them, or peer support. And for this, it was really interesting because it wasn't just that peer support, but it was actually certain lived experiences that were valuable and others really weren't. So like just having a baby might not be what one dad or what one parent really gels with. It's actually having the not the exact same thing, but so for example, colic, so putting two parents together that have babies with colic so they can be like, yes, it is hell. So, not just having that parenthood mean that you could be supported through that peer. So the practitioner is saying, if we can get parents along to some of our classes, it's unbelievably how quickly peer support networks happen. People suddenly realize they're not the only one that doesn't know how to do whatever it is. So that's really nice. And the parent saying, but they weren't the people that could help me with the issues I was having with my babies, because none of theirs had the same. But you need someone who's in it with you or who's been there in the past. So that's the important, she said it way better than I did. So that's the important part, having someone there that's experienced the things that you are. And I think this parent is talking about sleep issues with their child. And then the final main theme was the feeling of pressures of parenting, with which both fathers and mothers were feeling. And these pressures were hidden and unwritten. They weren't shared. If you think back to the question or the extract where it said, we weren't told about this. And so there was this knowledge that how services could lighten the load of parenting, but they didn't know where to access them necessarily. And we also found that this was all discussed in terms of first versus second child. The pressures of parenting differed through first versus second child. Although I can't actually say that because I'm usually a quantitative person, you can probably tell. So parents, the practitioner was saying, parents say, I need you to teach me some songs. I don't know how to play. And they're completely lost. They've lost confidence in their intuitive parenting. So, you know, the parents being like, I actually don't know how to do this. I'm feeling this pressure. I don't know. I'm not confident. And then the researcher is saying, sometimes it's almost like you get this block because you feel critiqued in your own parenting. So people are feeling critiqued. It's just this big pressure cooker, our society is with parenting. And then the parents saying it was a real shock, less of the shock the second time around, which is literally the case for everything when you have children, which that, you know, these pressures of parenting, it's super shocking, but it's not as shocking for the second time. That those pressures kind of lessen as you are used to going into the parenting world. And finally, information, taboo, discussion. So these were drivers of help seeking. So this all seemed to stem from these not knowing normal baby behaviors, not knowing what postpartum behaviors might be. So dads not realizing that they could be depressed. You know, oh, is it called? There was a whole discussion of what is it called? Is it still called postnatal depression in men? Through this one focus group, it was really interesting to hear that, you know, even it was a psychologist talking, even a psychologist didn't know what to call it in men. So this general lack of information and discussions around the topics, they just aren't talked about until you're actually talking to another parent. And the researchers and practitioners were really understanding this discussion of normal experiences to those stories, like we were talking about, and things that aren't really mentioned to these new parents. So a practitioner says, because people were coming to me because they've got depression and anxiety, but a lot of it's real normal experience, the adjustment of parenthood. So yes, a lot of normalizing. And then a parent saying, understanding better what the realms of normal baby behavior might be, what one parent's experiencing, and babies sleeping through the night is definitely not what I was experiencing and how I felt like I was failing somehow. So this information made her feel those pressures of parenting. And so, like I said before, the key areas that were discussed are also going to be discussed in the paper, but these were the main themes that we found. And so with the bigger picture, I gave kind of an example. So even though the three groups were separated, so every group came to a different Zoom session. So it was really interesting that all of these same themes came out through the practitioners, the researchers, and the parents. They all had these themes. So to me, that's really interesting. And so many of the issues with COVID, polarizing these issues actually made them easier to see because, you know, we might not have seen them as clearly if COVID hadn't polarized them. And then the call for the father support was huge. Parent status has been correlated. I just kind of thought about in terms of you know, the research right now, which actually are in the notes of these slides, and anyone can grab these slides. I'll make them available. But it's been correlated with greater mental health issues through COVID, being a parent. The incongruent advice and competing services is also in the research, the peer support narratives, and the idea that pressure can be lifted through that discussion of normal behavior. But what I thought to do in terms of applications, concentrating on parental rather than just maternal mental health, not just in the first few weeks. So a lot of these parents still were having issues, and you know, the dads as well, because there were a few dads that had talked about this during the focus group. Also thinking about more father experiences in terms of transition to parenthood. So providing dads with more experiences, more information about experiences postpartum, and more information leading up to that birth of their child, and making more use of peer support for both parents, you know, having dads train for peer support. And finally, the increased discussion of taboo subjects and realities of new parenthood. And so next steps, we were thinking creating tailored programs for new parents based on this research, reaching out to those who may not feel included. A lot of it had to do with like being able to tell their own stories. And then, of course, just like any other study, this study had lots of limitations. Obviously, a self-selected group of people because they had come to this Zoom event and they were interested in setting up the Parent Hub. So they might be people that think that more help is needed anyway. There were also people around York, and most of the participants were upper middle class. They all had internet. You could see this in the discussions. None of them talked about taking a bus in to the groups or taking a bike or any other mode of transportation. They all talked about coming in cars. And then the questioning style may have led to answer in certain ways. So where does this leave us? Well, Parenthood 2021 informed the breastfeeding and legal support that we offer, as well as the new focus on fathers. So we're now really trying to, Ernestine, I'm sure will tell you about the other things that have come out of these themes. And we're currently now trying to start to recruit for a project called Penning Parenthood. I'm working with Abby Curtis, who's a professor of English. And she and I are looking to recruit dads that want to try their hand at some writing and think about how writing might help process those those new parenthood experiences. And this is actually all evidence-based. We've found that expressive writing actually helps to process those feelings in new parenthood. Thanks, and I'm open to any questions. Was that too long? I'm hoping not.
Thank you so much, Paige. At the moment, I can't see any question in the Q&A yet. I'm just encouraging people to put their questions in. Even as we go along, if questions come up, please just put them in the Q&A, and we will aim to answer all the questions at the time that we have open conversations. So thank you so much, Paige. So we're going to listen now to Samantha Short, who will be talking on the topic, an exploration of mental health, perceived social support and conformity to masculine norms in new and experienced fathers. Thank you, Samantha. Over to you.
Thank you. I know that it's a very catchy title. I might actually think about how I might make it a little bit more fluent. So yeah, welcome to my presentation. I'm Sammy Shaw. I'm a doctoral trainee in counselling psychology at York St John, and this is the first half of my thesis, and I've got the pleasure of being supervised by Paige and Ernestine, so I get to learn a lot from them, and it's been a great project. Really, I've really enjoyed it so far. So, why study dads? So on a personal level, I'm fascinated by parenting. I think it's just such a wonderful, scary thing to do. And so I knew that I'd naturally want to study parents, and I was introduced to Paige and Ernestine, and they were interested in dads, so we went with it. And yeah, like I say, it's been fantastic so far. So becoming a parent can be really challenging, exciting, rewarding, but around 8 to 10% of dads are reported to experience depression in the postnatal period, which is twice that we see in the general population. And 75% of completed suicides in the UK by men. And fathers have with perinatal mental health difficulties have been reported to be 47 times more likely to be rated as a suicide risk than at any other time in their lives. So I just think it's really important for us to get to grips with what's going on there, and to study dads and to think about dads. It just shows a clear need, and that the transition to fatherhood might indicate a time of increased vulnerability to psychological distress. There's a lot of stresses going on, a big transition in dads' lives. As Paige talked about, the support's often focused on maternal well-being and not dads. The interview data shows dads often feel left out or don't want to take attention away from mum and baby, and just generally not knowing where to go for support. And research also shows that there's an impact of father mental health on a range of child outcomes. So things like playfulness that might be quite difficult for a dad experiencing depression has been shown to be linked to child brain development. So these things are quite important for child as well as dad. Yeah. Conformity to masculine norms. So it just relates to like the messages that are sent to men and boys about acceptable ways of being in society. And there has been a link shown between masculinity and mental health in the general population. So we wanted to know if this applied to dads, really. The interview data shows a lot about being strong, a lot of themes around being strong or a rock in the family. This quote was taken, I think, from one of Andrew Mayer's studies. What sort of man gets depressed after having a baby? And I tend to do the typical man thing of hiding it until I can do so no longer. So these themes seem to be cropping up in the interview data. And I wanted to know what does this look like? What do the numbers look like on this? Like if we research this, would there be a relationship there? And as a counselling psychologist, I'm quite interested in how it translates to therapy and therapeutic practice. So I turned to Carl Rogers, the founder of person-centered therapy, and I thought about something called conditions of worth, which are things that we learn in childhood about acceptable ways of being. And this could be related to masculinity in that what are the messages that men and boys are sent around mental health? What do men feel are okay? What do dads feel is okay regarding the mental health? So a child might be sent the message, boys don't cry, or have toughness being implicitly rewarded in early life. This is a really individualized process and very individual to the person. But I think as a society, these messages are there. And this could relate to dads in that experiencing distress after having a baby could lead to an incongruence in what they feel is okay. So it could be something like, men shouldn't be depressed. I shouldn't be feeling like this. There must be something wrong with me for feeling this way, which could understandably lead to psychological distress. And the next thing we were interested in was social support. So they say it takes a village to raise a child. Well, it's also really important for parental well-being, maintaining relationships and being able to talk to other parents and family members and maintain those social connections. It could be difficult to socialise because priorities change. Increased stress might also make connecting with others harder and reducing opportunities for intimacy in partnerships. So we wanted to look at that. And the research shows that fathers in particular have reported having difficulty reaching out when they are in distress and keeping things more lighthearted in nature. One of the studies talks about sharing war stories with other dads as a way of coping. So we wanted to look at that too. So these were my research questions. Is there a relationship between conformity to masculine norms and depression and anxiety symptoms in the postpartum period? The same for perceived social support. So is social support associated with depression and anxiety? And also, is there a difference between new and experienced fathers? So this was looking at first-time dads and second-time dads. Research is quite mixed on that, but having multiple children could bring different stresses, or having that experience might alleviate those stresses. And we wanted to see if there was a significant difference between first and second time dads. So these were the participants. We managed to find 118 dads to fill in our survey. It was quite difficult to recruit dads, so I think 108. I feel quite proud that we managed to get that many. Yeah, the sample was quite homogenous, so most of the dads identified as white, British or Scottish. That was 110, and only 8 identified as non-white, Black, British and Asian. The mean age of the dads was 34, and it ranged from 23 to 52. And the age of the youngest child had to be under 12 months of age, and the mean age was 7.14 months. Most were heterosexual, 2 identified as bisexual, and 1 were homosexual. And most were employed full-time, 3 were part-time, and 3 were self-employed. There were no people that were unemployed as part of the sample. So here's what we did. So we published a survey using Qualtrics, and we also used Prolific, which was a lifesaver when it came to sourcing participants. Yeah, it took around 10 minutes to complete. It was just a number of measures. So we asked some demographic variables, just about their parenting status and employment status, things like that. And also we asked about whether their partner had support for a health condition, mental health or physical health, or both. And then they were presented with 3 questionnaires. So the first one was the Edinburgh Post-Natal Depression Scale, which it's commonly used in perinatal services to assess depression and anxiety symptoms in mums, and it's also been validated for use in fathers as well. And then we selected 4 subscales from the Conformity to Masculine Norms inventory. So this scale captures Western ideas around masculinity. We only selected 4 because there were a lot of subscales that didn't really apply, like around aggression and things like that. So the ones we selected were emotional control, and they were questions around talking about feelings, whether they felt able to talk about feelings and whether it was something that they found easy. Power over women, I personally I hate the title of that subscale, but it was all about being in charge, and thinking about having a baby. We thought it's a very female dominated world, and so we selected that around how that to see how that might play out and how that might feel for dads. Self-reliance was about asking for help, and primacy of work was about how important work is to the dad. And the final one was a multi-dimensional scale of perceived social support, which splits social support into 3 areas: intimate relationships, family and friends, to see how supported the dad felt. So here's what we found. So there wasn't any significant difference between first and second time dads. So we grouped all of the dads together for the rest of the analysis. Okay, all measures were significantly correlated. So the masculinity measure was positively correlated with depression, which means that higher masculinity was correlated with higher depression. And with social support, higher social support was correlated with lower depression. And the strongest relationship was actually between masculinity and social support. So the more masculine the person reported, the lower the social support they had around them. And to break this down a little bit further, only 2 of the scales from the masculinity measure were associated with depression, and those were self-reliance, so that around asking for help, and primacy of work, around how important work is to the person. Surprisingly, emotional control wasn't associated with depression, so it didn't really seem to matter whether the dads preferred to talk about the feelings or not, which I was quite surprised about. And all of the scales of the social support measure were significantly correlated with depression. So higher social support from partner, family and friends was associated with lower depression scores. And this was an interesting finding. So we asked the question, has your partner received support for a health condition? And the only significant relationship was between both physical and mental health, and nothing. And yeah, I've got that right. Sorry, I'm reading my own data there. Yeah, so basically, there was no significant relationship between mental health alone, physical health alone, and no support. But there was quite a large relationship between both physical and mental health and no support, which indicates that a higher level of complexity might be really important in impacting dad's mental health. So partner's health is quite important for dad's mental health, basically. So what are the implications of this? So it was the first study in the UK to look at these variables and correlating masculinity and social support with the Edinburgh Postnatal Depression scale. And what I feel it says is that dads might not ask for help when they're struggling, basically. And how can we as services accommodate for this? How can we adapt to that? Work pressures might also impact on dad's well-being. What support's available in the workplace for dads? I'm sure Ernestine will have more to say on this, but it's things like, do dads get time off to seek support for their mental health? That's a big question. Or is the culture there to facilitate that for dads? What support's there for dads to interact socially, to be able to build, to maintain those social contacts that are really important for well-being? And do we as services need to put in the extra effort to ask dads about the mental health? If it was offered, would dads take the support? And some ideas on how this might be applied. I'm open to more ideas in the chat. So the introduction of mental health checks for new fathers in 2018 was a step in the right direction, but that only applied to dads whose partners were experiencing mental health problems. What about universal health checks? What about including dad in that process in a similar way that it is currently for mums. Having a workplace culture that would make it easy, like opportunities to take leave without fear of losing income. And there's an increase in online community focused on connecting dads socially. Would dads attend organised face-to-face groups? It could be a positive way to improve mental health outcomes. Not even there to talk about mental health or talk about feelings. I think just, as I mentioned earlier, the sharing war stories and just connecting with other dads who have been through similar experiences could be really helpful. And I think that as practitioners, we should try to normalise these difficulties so that it feels okay to share. Being involved in those early postnatal appointments and having open discussions is important, particularly if mum's experiencing distress herself. But this is individualised as well. I think it's important to remember that these are just relationships between variables. So it doesn't apply to all dads all the time. So we really need to put together individualised support packages for dads. And I think taking opportunities to change the common narrative around male mental health and dad's mental health is quite crucial. It needs to be okay to ask for help. There were quite a few limitations to the study. So it was cross-sectional, which means that we just got a snapshot of a group of dads at one point in time, and we can't really be sure of the direction of relationships. So do dads who are experiencing more depression have less social support as a result of the depression? When we can't be 100% sure. Or does help seeking become more salient if dads are experiencing depression? We're not sure. There was no control group, so is this relationship just specific to dads or men in general? It'd be really interesting to follow dads into fatherhood to see how it plays out. That would be a really interesting idea for future research if I have time. And the sample wasn't very diverse. I've noticed this in the research. It seems to be quite tough to recruit representative populations. So I think a focus should go on widening that to different dads. And for as far as my work, the second half of my thesis, I'll be turning to mental health practitioners to think about what can be done to support dads there, and thinking about how do we as services perpetuate these ideas around dad's mental health. Okay, so that's the end. Does anybody have any questions?
Thank you so much, Samantha. There is no question in the Q&A. However, what I'm thinking is, because I'll do my own presentation now, I'll probably leave about 10 minutes for discussions and questions based on Paige and yours and my presentations. So that will then take us up to 12 o'clock, where we will have a lunch break. So I will do my presentation now, and then we can take questions or contributions from people on that. There was a question for Paige earlier on. There's a question for you, but we will pick up on those questions if that's okay.
Thank you. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Samantha. So that leads us to the next presentation, which is May. And I'm going to share my screen with you. Samantha, I can see you, but can you see my screen? Brilliant, thank you. So, right, so I'm just going to pick up the presentation and conversations from basically where Paige and Samantha left off. So we're looking at the fathers, so that's majorly the focus. And my title, the title I chose, which I thought was really interesting based on what I was seeing, was what or where is the support for fathers transitioning into parenthood? Now, I have been doing research on shared parental leave for about 4 years now. And I did some research, which I was basically looking at what are the challenges of shared parental leave. And that led me into doing more research around breastfeeding and shared parental leave, because breastfeeding emerged as one of the key challenges. However, I also then realized through my work and through working with Paige as part of the Parenthood Center, that one key thing that was massively missing was issues related to fathers. So why was I focusing, or why am I focusing on fathers? Because a lot of you who probably know me will know that I do a lot of work covering mothers, shared parental leave, support in the workplace. So why am I looking at fathers? Why? It's because when I started looking at it and also talking to mothers and listening to what they were saying, and some of the fathers that I had spoken to in terms of shared parental leave, I couldn't help with this whole aspect or norm around masculinity, where it's all about, so you are a man, so as a man, you shouldn't be doing this, you shouldn't cry, you shouldn't complain, you shouldn't be asking for support, you should just get on with things. So I heard a lot of that even through the mothers that I was talking to. I heard a lot of that through some of the fathers I initially spoken to about 3 years ago. Well, that caught my interest, because then I started to sort of look within the context of the policies to understand how this is all playing out. So looking at policies, where we start to question where, or ask, where is the father within policies, and just looking at some of the standard family-friendly policies that we have, such as maternity leave, paternity leave, shared parental leave, and so on. Within the policies, you see that separation, that identity, that masculinity norms is very much embedded in the policies that we have. Because when you look at maternity leave, is 52 weeks. Then when you look at paternity leave, is 2 weeks. Then when you look at shared parental leave, which I'll be talking a little bit more about it, it's about, okay, mothers, you can share your maternity leave. However, if you don't give your consent, the father cannot share. So if the mother doesn't want to share, it doesn't matter how much the father wants to share, that is not going to happen. Now, when I started to look at the workplace context of things, you see that you can walk around, even when there are conversations around having babies, a mother, you will probably hear a lot more encouraging work, a lot more around what the workplace can do to support the mother. The fathers, very much less so, because the father will say, oh, we're expecting a baby. They get the odd congratulations. So when are you going? When will you be back to work? And nothing much seems to follow that conversation. Then when you look at the societal society very much looks at the man, because it's still, unfortunately, very much driven by the man as a breadwinner and the mother as a primary caregiver. So when some fathers do say to me that actually, when I'm walking around pushing my baby in a buggy, I still get a lot of stares, people looking. It's just that kind of unwelcoming, in some instances more patronizing, saying, oh, you are a father. Are you a stay-at-home father? Is it your turn to look after the babies today? All those sort of phrases, words that people use on fathers. Then when you start to think about the health profession, within the context, I couldn't help but think about what I have gone through, or what my family or my husband has gone through. I've got 2 girls, but I could not for any 1 minute think about a time when the health professionals, either going to antenatal classes, or having the health visitors at home, or even when I was in the hospital in labor, things like that. I can't remember anything or any phrase or anyone just asking my husband, how are you doing? Or saying, this is how you do things, or there's support here for you. I couldn't help but think about that. So all of this really got me interested and wanting to explore a little bit more about fathers within the context of the family-friendly rights that we have, and specifically on shared parental leave that I'm working on my other projects, and what is there in the workplace, and what parts are the society and health professionals playing into all of this. Now, with that in the back of my mind, I'm thinking about shared parental leave, which I started to touch on a little bit. But with shared parental leave, now there has been, and there's massive studies out there showing that dads really want to be more and more involved in family commitment, in helping, in bonding with the baby, wanting to be the first ones that the baby can say daddy or dada, rather than the almost what we can consider standard mommy, which is usually the first words that the baby will say. Now, there's been a lot of questions and studies around this, questioning why is it that most babies will say mommy first? Well, it goes without saying, because mothers are always there. Like I was talking about the policies, it doesn't make it easy for the fathers to be there as much as the mothers do. Now, whilst there was a lot of critique around the fact that paternity leave is only 2 weeks and maternity leave is 52 weeks, the UK government decided to introduce shared parental leave. Now, the rationale behind shared parental leave is obviously fantastic, because they're thinking about that gender equality, thinking about giving fathers and mothers that opportunity and flexibility to decide how they share the leave, how they really get involved with their family, and how they're bonding, giving them that flexibility. However, whilst that was a very good step in the right direction, the policymakers did what I consider, or what I consider the main obstacle, which in many ways defeats the whole purpose of the policy for me. Now, the policymakers made the mothers the gatekeepers to shared parental leave. Making the mothers gatekeepers means that if a mother doesn't want to share her leave, the father has no choice, has no right to share. What does that mean then? Is that really fostering and acknowledging the place of the father? If we go back to the rationale, thinking that they wanted to give the fathers more time, you would say that actually it's done nothing as such, because it really depends on the mother whether she wants to share the leave. Should the policymakers have thought about a policy that will give fathers an independent right not to depend on the mothers or their partners for what we can almost consider a free will gift? Oh, you want to be part of the child's life? Okay, I can give you some of my weeks. I can give you some of my months. What does that sound? Is it not just back to some of the things we were talking about in terms of looking at how society patronizes dads, how dads are almost considered to be not a parent, they are there, like a baby making, almost someone who contributed to the child being there. Now, whilst that is one of the major challenges for shared parental leave in terms of fathers, we also have the aspect, we also have the fact that it is, if your mothers decide to take shared parental leave, or the father and the mother decides to take shared parental leave is actually paid at the statutory rate. There is zero financial incentive for fathers to want to give up time to stay at home. At the end of the day, having a baby doesn't always come cheap. It comes with a lot of financial demands. You will have to buy nappies, you will have to buy clothes, you will have to learn an awful lot of things. And they don't come with a manual anyways. You have to learn and understand them as you go along. It's an expensive task, a beautiful one at that, but it is expensive. So given that shared parental leave is paid at the statutory rate, it means that there is rather a disincentive rather than an incentive for fathers to want to take shared parental leave. Now, when we set out to look at fathers and to consider all these things, what we really wanted to be able to extract from the studies to understand and evaluate knowledge and behavior of fathers around shared parental leave. Because first of all, it's crucial to know what they understand or what they know about shared parental leave and start to understand what they feel about it. Also to evaluate the support that is available to fathers, not just in the workplace, but in the wider community. And wider community, we're referring to the society, as well as professional health support. To understand what the presence or the lack of support, what impact it could have on fathers. Already, it's a good thing that Samantha went ahead of me, so I don't need to go into this that much because Samantha has already demonstrated to us that where there is support, there is less mental health related issues or depression or anxiety with fathers. Also to identify, which is one of the key things that links back to the Parenthood project and the activities that we're interested in putting or the activities we are also already running to ensure that we can support fathers. We really wanted to identify what we need to do to be able to support fathers. So how did this happen? So following up from the Parenthood 2021, which Paige talked about, so when we went off to interview 20 fathers to try and find out what they thought, what were their experiences. So we interviewed 20 fathers, and the interview lasted on average of 50 minutes. Some of them I really enjoyed, as well as really did not enjoy the conversations, because some of the conversations were challenging, but what was good about it was that we started in that process of interviewing to identify what measures we could put in place quite quickly to try and provide some kind of support to fathers. So just at the stage of the interview, we identified a need to create a WhatsApp group that was only for fathers to support fathers. And that has been going well since the interviews took place last year, July. Now, what did we find? I would like to say that what I'm going to be talking about today is just an aspect of the findings that we got. Now, there's still a heavy lot of analysis still going on, but it is very, very interesting and thought-provoking what we've already seen. Now, the very first thing was fathers, or what was coming out of the findings was fathers talking about the visible lack of support in policy documents, which I started to talk about already. Now, paternity leave, of course, fathers were talking about the fact that paternity leave is not enough. First of all, it's just 2 weeks. Interestingly, when I spoke to the fathers, the conversation was like, okay, so when your partner is pregnant, yes, there are a lot of changes that is happening in the body of the partner, and you can see the stomach is growing, or if you had adopted a child, that would be a slightly different experience. But for people who had a baby, the partners, the fathers were saying, I could see what was happening with my partner or with my wife At the same time, I could only imagine, and in many instances, I didn't feel that connected because it was more of, okay, so I can see the baby will be born soon. I'm excited, but in terms of really intentionalizing things and getting to understand what is going on, many did not. So when the baby then arrived and they were on paternity leave, most of the fathers explained it, the way they articulated it to me was more like they've been hit by a train. So all of a sudden, here is the baby. Okay, what am I supposed to do with this baby? How much do I know? And with paternity leave just being 2 weeks, it's not enough for a father to kind of take in everything that has happened, the changes that has happened, the change in routine, the change in just acknowledging or just taking it in that there is a new baby. So 2 weeks, most of them said, was not enough. Now, it is different in the context if the father, or if not the father, if the baby was probably ill or the mother was ill after birth, it makes it incredibly difficult because if they have to spend more time in the hospital, it means that the father at the end, by the time the baby comes back or the baby and the mother comes back home, depending on the circumstances, the 2 weeks probably in most cases would have been long gone. So the father is back at work at the same time, being unable to support or just bond with the child. So they talked about the paternity leave being 2 weeks being incredibly unsupportive from a policy perspective. And then the shared parental leave, like I was talking about. So one of the fathers said, so with shared parental leave, you're effectively taking the time your wife or girlfriend has to rest. You are taking it away from them. They are not giving you extra time to be off as effectively that you can have maybe 6 months. Well, we will have 6 months, we will have 3 months. You are borrowing the time that she needs to rest from her. Now, if you look at this quote, and there was many that I heard, you could hear the father saying, actually, I really don't want to take it. I can see that they need it. Like, not just about recovering as well, but the bonding, and also for those that were breastfeeding, say, I really want my wife to be able to breastfeed as long as possible. I also want to be there to support her through the journey of breastfeeding, because as we know, breastfeeding can be incredibly challenging for some people. Now, sharing that leave made it uncomfortable because the norm from a long time ago seemed to suggest that it's a woman's time, it's not a man's time. So there's aspects of guilt in there, asking for a father asking to share that leave. All the same, I spoke to some fathers who had taken shared parental leave, who shared the leave. But interestingly, most of them tend to take the last 3 months, which is unpaid leave of the maternity leave. So they tend to allow the mothers to take the first 9 months just to rest as well as breastfeed if they want to breastfeed, and to kind of lessen the guilt that they feel in terms of that they are taking the leave from the mothers. Now, whilst that was good, it still leaves them with a lot of questioning, like, should this really be the case? Should I really have to be sharing my partner or my wife's leave? One of the interesting we found as well is that although we can already see that there are challenges with the way the policy is in the first place, the other thing as well is that the implementation of these policies across different employers are not exactly the same. Whilst paternity leave seems to be standard and straightforward and many people just understand it, unfortunately, shared parental leave is one of the most complex policy that I have ever had to read myself, coming from a law background. there is a lot of still unawareness around shared parental leave. And unfortunately, we still have an awful lot of employers who do not understand the policy and consequently are unable to actually articulate it very well to parents who may or could benefit from that. So it still really comes down to the employer's knowledge and skills and beliefs of what they think. And beliefs is in addition to the fact that the policy is complex in itself, one of the real problems is belief. Why? Because still a lot of workplaces are still set up on the model of man as a breadwinner and woman as a primary caregiver. So their beliefs is more like, when a man says, I'm going to take 2 months on shared parental leave, like one of the fathers articulated to me, the line manager went, what? Why? Why would you want to be at home? That's a woman's job. And that is very, very offensive and very deeply rooted in the cultural stereotypes that we've had for a very long time. Now, one of the key things as well we found out was that in the midst of all this is what happens when a father is going back to work, irrespective of the type of leave that they are taking. Now, obviously, many fathers were complaining about that short leave that they've got and comparing it to maternity leave. And interestingly so, most workplaces tend to enhance maternity leave so much. For some of them will enhance maternity leave for 6 months. But when you look at their paternity leave, it's not enhanced. Whilst some workplaces will enhance the maternity leave, enhance the 2 weeks 2 weeks paternity leave, but will not enhance the shared parental leave, making it uninteresting, unattractive to fathers who will very much would have loved to take that time to bond with the baby. Now, going back to work also meant that fathers was faced with challenges of lack of bonding, and this lack of bonding was mirrored through what they thought was the kind of visible lack of support in the workplace as well. So whilst they didn't know much, which we're going to talk about support from professional or health professionals shortly, whilst there was not much support leading up to the baby arriving, and there was no much support when the baby was born, going back to work with most fathers, employers tend to treat them like they simply went to the toilet and they are back. There isn't much discussion about or acknowledgement of what has happened in the life of that father and what that means and will continue to mean or have impact on him from there onwards. So there is that total lack of acknowledgement, which then makes it very, very difficult for fathers because they feel kind of alone in what they're experiencing. And also it means that for some of them, as they articulated to me, means that they feel like they can't talk about it. They feel like they can't ask their managers for any kind of support. Now, if we look at what one of the participants said, well, I've been back to work for a while because I only got 2 weeks off. So I'm trying to do all that. I'm trying to juggle going to work because this is way before COVID. So I'm still going to the office. So I'm trying to juggle doing that with also looking after her, my wife and child. And I think sometimes you're expected to do too much without a lot of support. In terms of no one asks you how you're feeling, no one asks you how you're doing, and or even to ask if you need help. So this is just one, expressing what happens in the workplace. There is an awful lot in terms of conversations that can be had with the mother, but with the father, it's kind of like completely doesn't register anywhere in anybody's mind that they need to have same conversations with fathers. Now, looking at support from health professionals, so a lot of our participants talked about the absence of support from health professionals, all the way from pre-baby arriving to baby being there and not just getting any support at all. So many of the participants expressed that they were not frequently engaged through the antenatal or birth or immediate postnatal processes, so there was just lack of information. Now, what we found out was that they said if you go to like antenatal classes, if they have to talk to you, they're telling you about what to do for your wife when it's time to have a baby, or if you spot the sign, you do this. If you spot that, you do that. If she goes into labor, you do that. And even in the labor room or in the delivery room, it's more about help her to breathe, talk to her about this, and do this and do that. When the baby is born, it's like, here is the baby, you do this to the baby, you look after the baby. And there isn't anything anywhere in terms of, for you, this is what it could be, or this is what it could mean to you. This is where support is for you, because you will be going through an awful lot of things. That is completely missing. The father, as some of them articulated to me, are treated like a third wheel. You're just there to support the system. You're just there to make sure that things go well. No one really thinks about you. So men or the fathers were saying that because of the lack of support and all the way through, it is making it incredibly difficult for them. That lack of support is just, it really doesn't help them either in maybe just knowing what to do, or even feeling like they can ask what is going on, or they could say, I am struggling here, I need some help. Participants illustrated throughout the lack of information sharing about their child's immediate post-birth health. It was something like they treated, for the fathers that I spoke to, it came across like it was like, you are here to support them, but in terms of key information, what is happening to the baby and to your wife, that information is for your wife and not for you. You can wait. We will probably at some point when we feel necessary to tell you. Meanwhile, they are telling the mother what is going on, explaining everything, almost treating the father like, you don't have a business in this, or if we explain, you will not understand, or what do you need the information for? Making it really challenging. And this is one of the key points that we identify that causes a lot of anxiety and anxiousness and stress for the fathers, because they don't just know what is going on. And at the same time, what they're getting back is kind of like, you should be supporting them, you should be strong, you should be the man here. One of the things we also identified was, which I could say is a real need to facilitate informal support. Now, formal supports are also very important, which I did talk about, but we also need to talk about informal support networks for fathers. Now, recently, we are beginning to see much more of these groups coming up, but it's nowhere near the numbers that is expected. It's nowhere near as famous, not so famous, as popular and common as it should be. Now, the absence of these informal groups, what it's doing is actually just making the fathers feel more alone, feel more estranged in all of this. The fathers articulated to me that some of the fathers said, well, we were in a group like NCT groups. We joined NCT groups, but we found out that the groups were all dominated by women. And the type of things that they talk about sometimes comes across like they're slacking the fathers. So it's kind of like they're having a go at men. Once you will find a lot of groups, which is moms only, which is supporting moms greatly, you really don't tend to find much, which is one of the reasons why during the interview phase, we created the WhatsApp group just for fathers. Fathers need to feel that they've got their own space, a space where they can talk about these things. They can talk about the challenges, the frustration, and get advice. But a lot of this isn't, unfortunately, available. Now, just look at one of the quotes I've put there. So, because what happens is you just have a look for support, because there's no visible support, so fathers have to go looking for support. You just look for support groups, and then when you can't, you are struggling to find it, you just give up. You just give up, don't you? And basically, you just resign to deal with it yourself. So because the groups are not common, they are not always there, it means that when a father can't find a group for fathers, they just resign and just deal with it themselves. Now, dealing with it themselves is where we really need to be conscious and be aware of. What does it mean to deal with it themselves? Is it sinking into depression? Is it rising up above the challenge? How are they dealing with it? And leaving it to them to deal with it themselves, are we not just actually, does it just not mean we just kind of enforcing the already stereotype of man, you are a man, you deal with it, and the women can have support? Now, so we looked at one of the things that came out as experiences of fatherhood and parental division of labor. Now, one of the aspects was that many of the fathers we talked about, and maybe because the fathers that were interested were the ones that really wanted to be part of the family, and they were interested in talking about the challenges. Could be so. But we saw that during the immediate post-birth, many of the participants expressed that paternity leave, any kind of leave, was very important, because it could give them that chance to support their wives, to bond with the baby, to do all that they need to do. As well as some of the fathers actually articulated that that time is really crucial, because whilst if you've just had a newborn baby and maybe the mother is breastfeeding, although the father cannot breastfeed, the father is using that time to do things around the house to support the family and be there. Now, which is great. However, when you then start to look at the impact of the pandemic to try and build into this division of labor in the household, we found that in terms of that, there was a real challenge to the status quo, in terms of we were so used to man being the breadwinner, or that gender stereotype, and we're so used to men getting up and getting out of the house and going to work and coming back. And when they come back, depending on them, on the father, might come back and try to engage, or might come back and say they're very tired and they want to rest. But the lockdown really presented an opportunity to challenge the status quo. Now, what we found out was that fathers were saying they had a great time because they were there and they were able to be more engaged. However, there was the challenge of, how do I really juggle these things? I am at home, I need to do work, I've got my kids. How do I separate the two? I really want to be back at work. At the same time, I love being with my kids. So fathers, I don't know, I haven't looked at any studies to see whether this is something that happens with moms, but what came out of our studies demonstrated that some of the fathers were really struggling in terms of separation, or of what they need to do in terms of, is it work time now? Oh, my daughter is crying. Can I leave work and go and see why she's crying? How do I juggle these? And there was a real worry for some of the fathers, saying, well, they built that relationship with the family, which they love. Now going back to work, so after the pandemic, going back to work, how are they going to deal with that separation? It's something, an area which I think will be worth exploring further in terms of research. And then because of that, we saw a lot of fathers were talking about the need for more flexible working. Now, there is an awful lot of research out there already to demonstrate that in terms of flexible working, men are not usually very successful in flexible working requests, but women are. This is a chance to challenge all these. Now, in terms of mental health, we found that all these challenges, starting from policies not being really supportive of fathers, going to workplace, not acknowledging what fathers go through, going to the health professionals, not acknowledging that they actually need to cater for fathers as well. Going to the societal norms, which looks at fathers thinking you should be a man. All of this is having a massive impact on fathers' mental health, because all through the process, they don't feel like they can speak up. They feel like they will be looked at, you're a man, you should be able to deal with this much better. So like I said, this is kind of like just a whistle-stop shop of just kind of a tiny part of the findings that came out of this study, and much more will follow later with time. But I would like to stop there and thank you for listening. So if I stop sharing and then I come back to seeing everybody, we've got 9 minutes to go, and I'm just going to check in the Q&A. Okay, I can see that the earlier, okay, questions have been answered. I'm just going to pick up on the one question I've seen that is left here from Jess Hobbs. Says, this is more of a point for discussion than a question. I am sold on enhancing the shared parental leave available to dads, but I was thinking about how to lobby for more. Industry is powerful and could oppose more leave for dads. How can we convince industry to support more paternal leave? What is it? What is in it for employers? That's a very, very good point, Jess. Now, this is something that I have been working, because one of the other projects that I was working on, for example, was looking at shared parental leave and breastfeeding in higher education. Now, in terms of what is in it for the employers, if you look at it, employers, they've got maternity leave, and most of them tend to enhance maternity leave. You look at parental leave, and it's only 2 weeks. Now, what has been happening is, as you know, with babies, unless you sit down, really plan that we're going to get pregnant now, and then we'll get a baby by this time. Otherwise, if you think about pregnancies that happen when they happen, it means that in many ways, you cannot determine when the baby should arrive. So for employers, it will benefit them. Why? A lot of studies is out there to show that employers who are supportive, who are family friendly and support working parents, they get more productivity out of them. They are able to do the work to support the employer. Secondly, fathers, because paternity leave is paid at statutory rate, which is rubbish, unfortunately, fathers tend to amass their annual leave pending when they know a baby is coming. So if they take the leave, if they apply for the leave at that time, and you're trying to reject their leave, it will be difficult, although an employer would need to have a very good reason to reject it, but something like paternity leave, you cannot reject it. So there is, in terms of what and how the employees will feel in terms of, are you being supported? Do you feel valued in the workplace? We know that there's a lot of research out there which shows a direct correlation between employee satisfaction and employee productivity. So there is a lot in there for the employer. I think it will just be short-sighted for employers to think, there's not much in here for me. I
think Andy made a really good point also for greater staff loyalty.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree that also you get the loyalty of your staff, because it goes back to staff satisfaction. Like I said, if they are satisfied, if they are happy with you, they will stick with you. They will work with you. Thank you, Paige. And the question from Claudine: do you feel some men might use work as an escape from home? That's an interesting one, Claudine. I think that in the research that I did, I can almost say yes, based on 2 participants that I spoke to. Although I can say yes, I want to be to make this caution that there was a lot of cultural perception and cultural norms that played into their responses. So one of the participants said to me that in their culture, men have nothing to do with the children. So in terms of being at home, supporting the baby, their wife, and bonding with the baby, it's a woman's job from their culture, and end of. So they want to be back at work. So there is, although, like I'm saying, that came out from the study, but I was very conscious that those 2 people had a different background. There was a lot of cultural influence that was coming from that. But I cannot say in general terms whether men will want to use it as an escape from home. I cannot say. But if we don't support men, if policies don't support men, cultures, workplace, and so on, don't support men, then men will want to escape and go, they will want to go to work. They don't want those funny names. They don't want to be looked at funnily. And there's an awful lot that can be unpacked from that question, Claudine. I'm not sure if I've made justice for it, at least for now. I'm not sure. I was just about to read a question and it's gone.
Can I add to the escape from home? In my readings of the transcripts and being involved in the focus groups, I think moms also felt that way. I think a lot of times, just when you're not with another adult or when you're only with your partner, it is that real feeling of, okay, this is actually in a way time to oneself or time with other adults, or regaining that identity or trying to regain it. So that's just my 2 cents. I think it might be a parent thing even.
Yeah, I think in my study as well, there was a small relationship between dads that put work at high importance and depression. So I think for some dads that could placing work at that priority could actually have a negative impact on mental health.
Absolutely. Thank you. I'm just looking to see if there's any other question. I can see a point Jess made in the chat, which I'm quite interested in. Jess said, I was interviewing a young factory worker, father on low wage, and even he described SPL as unpaid leave. Now, people on low wages and basically other people working on precarious contracts, like 0 hours contracts and the rest, is basically unpaid because they are not eligible for it. So if you want to say, I'm going to take some time off, it's yeah, in many ways, I see why they describe it as such. And that is one of the problems with shared parental leave. It's really not open to all working parents. It's only open to working parents if you class yourself as an employee. An employee here within the strict definition of who an employee is. So you must be in full-time employment with guaranteed work. So if you're agency work, self-employed, 0 hours contract, and so on, it's not available to you. So that again is one of the challenges of shared parental leave. Okay, we've got, or I have got 11:59. I don't know if I'm right, but I think I am. So what we're going, or I've got 12 o'clock now. What we're going to do is we're going to go on break, lunch break, and then we will convene at 12:30 to listen to Scott and Andy present, and then we will have open conversations to pick up on anything and anything at all that has to do with fathers and these areas. Thank you. I will see you after the break. Right, welcome back, everybody, and thanks for coming back and being here with us. It's a pleasure now to welcome, I'll call your full name, Andrew Mayers, but Andrew likes to be called Andy. Is that right, Andy? Yeah, thank you. So we've got Andy.
I mean, it doesn't matter.
We've got Andy. Andy will be talking to us about, can fathers really get postnatal depression? Now that's a really exciting topic. Andy, over to you, please. Just a quick one again. If people have got questions, please put it in the Q&A. And if you've got contributions, just put it in the chat.
Yeah, and I'll try and pick up some of those shortly. So I will start sharing my screen. Bear with me. That should now be okay. You see that? Yeah. And I should be able to start from the beginning. So I won't be able to see the chat or the Q&A now. So I'll look at that when we stop sharing.
I'll keep an eye on it for you, Andy.
Thank you, Ernestine. And thanks for that introduction. Yes, one of the questions I'll be posing in this presentation will be, can dads get postnatal depression? But this is a much bigger thing. We're not just talking about postnatal depression, we're talking about lots of other things. And actually, I want to throw it open a little bit towards the end, thinking, do you know what? We need to be thinking about all partners, but a bit more about that later on. So yes, it will be largely about fathers' mental health and why that's all important. Largely looking at some of the things I've been doing. Samantha mentioned some of it earlier, but yes, I'll be mentioning some of the work we've been doing at Bournemouth University. But there's still a lot more work to be done. We've heard some of that today, but it's so good to see stuff being done. And as I say, I want to go beyond the fathers. I've been talking about fathers for quite a while now. There's other things I've been doing mums for a lot longer, but it is becoming increasingly obvious that we need to go beyond the binary, if you like. So I'm not going to run through all that. We've got limited time, or many of you know me anyway. But before I even start talking about fathers, let's be clear. I've been working in perinatal mental health, largely mums, for getting on for 20 years now, and it's only relatively recently that we started thinking about fathers too. So it's never been about dads instead of the mums. It's always been about what else do we need to do when we've been supporting the mums, and it became obvious we needed to start working with the fathers too. I'm involved, as you can see there, with a number of national organisations that focus on perinatal mental health, whether they be charities or support groups, and as advisor, as campaigner, as trustee, whatever it might be. There's many things that I'm involved with nationally to try and get a better deal, as it were, for parents, whether they be mothers, fathers, or so forth. If you're interested in what I do, you can always hop over to my website, andrewmayers.uk. You can also follow me on Twitter and Instagram. Happy to share these slides later as well, Ernestine, if you want to send those out to delegates. So essentially, I'm not going to spend too much time on this either, because I really want to get to the focus of what we're actually doing. But in all of those things, it is about informing them, the charities and organisations, about the work that I do, about informing the services that can be rolled out, about campaigning, even at the very heart of government, to get changes in policies, to get changes in the work that's being done. I mean, Ernestine was mentioning earlier about policies. Well, by campaigning, we actually got into the very heart of Parliament before all of this happened, and they did make changes, both for mothers and for fathers. And some of it was also involved in education. One of the questions that came up on the Q&A, Ernestine, and I inadvertently answered that, which is why it disappeared. I didn't realise it would do that. But it is about training the midwives and health visitors about dads too. So more of that later on. But why do they matter? Well, the work that we've been focusing on at Bournemouth University for about the last 5 years or so essentially focuses on 4 main areas, although we're looking to extend that too. The first thing was, what information, support, resources do we need to give fathers whose partner is experiencing mental health problems? And for many fathers, this is, the first time they might have encountered mental health problems. They may have been with their partner, their wife, for many years and never seen her like this before. And all of a sudden she becomes very unwell and he doesn't know what to do, or at least didn't know what to do. So we were looking at what we could do to give fathers the toolkit to be able to support his partner. But of course, we also recognise that fathers could develop mental health problems themselves, and we will be looking at postnatal depression in fathers a bit later on. But in doing that, we needed to know what kind of information, support, resources, toolkits we could give the fathers, because of course, we traditionally know the problems of stigma, manning up, the traditional male role model, if you like, often makes it a challenge to support men at this stage. One of the things we also did, and I suppose actually started propelling my work very much centre stage in the media, is when we started talking about fathers who have witnessed a birth trauma. Now, these days, fathers are more likely to be in that delivery room more than they ever were before, at least they were before COVID. And, they are actually witnessing these events. Now, of course, witnessing a birth, fine. I mean, that's what goes on. But when it actually starts going wrong, if there's a sudden threat to the health or even life of his wife, partner, and or the child, then he's there witnessing this, and that's going to have an impact. That's going to have potential for things like PTSD. We need to know what kind of information, support, resources, training we needed to be able to support fathers in that. Now, in all of those things, we needed to ask fathers, what support were they getting? What kind of support would they like? What was their experience with the health visitors, with the midwives, with the delivery room staff, with GPs and all that sort of thing? And that's what informed us about what we then needed to do in terms of training and getting the likes of Ennis and England to actually change their policies. More recently, and I haven't got the date for that yet, we also worked with fathers whose child had been, or infant had been admitted to a neonatal unit. Now, this is really important because it kind of goes back to what Ernestine was saying as well, in the sense that, fathers going back to work after 2 weeks, then if the baby has been admitted to a neonatal unit, chances are the baby's still there when he's gone back to work. And that's a terrible time to be going back to work. He needs to be there for his wife, his partner. He needs to be with her to go to the neonatal units. It's stressful enough without him having to go back to work. So that's another issue altogether. So these are the things we've been doing. And, it is important. I mean, why is it important? Well, because for all those reasons that mental health in new mums is important, so is the case for fathers too, because it's going to have an impact on his partner, his wife. It's going to have an impact on the interaction that he has with his infant. Now, with the work that we've done, we might not have a great deal of time. What I'm not going to focus on is method, results, implications, that sort of thing. You can read my papers. But essentially what we were finding in all of those areas of work was fathers were telling us they weren't recognised. They were ignored in that birthing room. They were ignored through pregnancy. They were ignored postnatally about their own mental health, about the impact of witnessing birth trauma, and about the kind of things they could do to support their partner. And of course, for all those reasons, nothing was getting better. Their own mental health, the mental health of their partner, all of those things, and the long-term impact could be dramatic. Now, because we started talking about these things and even getting in national media for this sort of stuff, we were then approached by NHS England to say, well, hang on, you're making enough noise about this now. What do you actually want us to do? And I'll talk about this a bit more later on, but essentially the research we did alongside other research that's been done nationwide at Fatherhood Institute and others, and the campaigning by the likes of Mark Williams and Scott and others, it did have an influence on NHS England, whereby they did announce towards the end of 2018 that fathers would now be screened for their mental health. Brilliant news, but I want to come back to that a bit later on about whether that's actually enough. So essentially, another thing that we need to look at here is, why is it important that we give fathers the toolkits to be able to support his partner if she experiences mental health problems? Why? Because one of the factors we know in the development of perinatal mental health problems in mothers is not having a supportive partner. That's not a judgment that they're not very good at it. It's more of a reflection on the fact that they haven't been given the toolkits to do that. So when we recognize that, that's when we actually need to start asking those questions, if you like. But we also know that despite what toolkits we might be able to give fathers to support his partner, because of what she's going through, or even independently of that, the fathers can experience mental health problems themselves. We've been hearing about some of that already today. So what we did find was that fathers, as I said, fathers were not getting that support from health professionals. They wanted more information, particularly about how to help their partner. They wanted more information about their own mental health. They wanted to know what services were around. You know, where can they go and get this support? What websites are available? What toolkits? We've now got great things like the Dad Pad, you know, and various other things where we can actually signpost fathers to, but they had no idea. And they also talked about what they would actually like in terms of the support, and also about where they could go for that support, and about how they can actually use those toolkits and what those toolkits are to support his partner and the baby. You can read about that work. If you go to my website, all of this work I'm going to be talking to you about is published on BMC Pregnancy and Childbirth, which is an open access journal, which means anybody can access that. So just go to my website, you can click on that, you can read the whole papers. So what about fathers and their own mental health? Well, we know from previous research that regardless of whether we call it postnatal depression or whatever it might be, we know around about 1 in 10 fathers will experience some kind of depression-like symptoms after the baby's been born. But crucially, and we were looking at some elements of suicide and what have you earlier on, much earlier on, and yes, indeed, 75% of all suicides are men. But it's even more likely within those men that becoming a new father and then experiencing postnatal-like depression symptoms will increase that risk of suicide. So those fathers who are having mental health problems postnatally are a greater suicide risk. And if that's no reason for, you know, for not doing something, I don't know what is. So there's that question that Ernestine said I was going to ask. Can dads get postnatal depression? Well, in terms of, is it the same as postnatal depression for mums? Well, it probably isn't the same, because we know that for mums, postnatal depression is very, very different for a mother than depression might be for a woman, similar age, background, everything else is the same, other than the fact she hasn't got a child. And these are largely to do with the intense guilt. Now, we all know through depression that one of the symptoms can be guilt. But for a mum, that guilt goes through the roof, largely because of the stigma and sort of expectation that this is a wonderful time and mums should be really happy. But she'll start questioning her own skills because she's feeling differently. And that guilt will then go through the roof, largely because she doesn't feel she's a good enough mum. And that can be the societal pressure. Then there's the complication of medication. For most adults, if they're depressed, there's an option of giving them medication. That's not to say we can't give pregnant women or new mums antidepressants, the likes of that, we probably can, depending on the dose and other situations. But it's still a complication. And it's also a complication for the mum, who might actually think, do I really want to take the medication? Other people are telling me it's dangerous without even going to a GP to check. So it's a complication. Then there's this whole thing about breastfeeding. Quite apart from the fact of the potential complication with medication and breastfeeding, the way in which depression might develop in postnatally for a new mum might mean it becomes more difficult to breastfeed. We kind of touched on breastfeeding a little bit earlier on, but this is really important because either because of the medication or because the mum's not feeling great mentally and physically, there can become a problem with actually breastfeeding. Now that then triggers another sense of guilt. You know, I'm a bad enough mum. I can't do this right now. I can't even breastfeed, and that makes her feel worse, even worse still. This is important because many health visitors, midwives, and so forth have traditionally then turned to the mum and said, "Well, that's okay. You can bottle feed. You can use formula," but that's not what the mums want to hear. They want to know what kind of support they can get to be able to do that breastfeeding. Then, of course, there's the interaction with the baby. I mention all of this because the fathers don't get many of these things. They don't necessarily get this same kind of mum guilt that the mothers do. There isn't this complication with a medication. There isn't this complication with breastfeeding. For that reason, it's very different. But, you know, I'm often asked the question, and it could be at a conference or it can be live on the radio. Oh, you know, men can't get postnatal depression. It's all hormonal, surely. Well, no, it's not. But then it's not for women either, because baby blues is hormonal. Baby blues is very much about those hormones changing from the pregnancy to breastfeeding and all that sort of thing. Postnatal depression in mums is much more about those environmental things. It's much more about the situation she might be in, or a history of mental health problems, or employment, education, finances, having a supportive partner, as I mentioned before. The same is for fathers. It's environmental, it's psychological. It's about that transition. We were hearing about this earlier, transition into fatherhood, about the changes in relationship with the partner. It's about those changes in finance, because his partner's gone on maternity leave and there might be a sudden change in income, but particularly about the stigma towards men. So it is, you know, yes, men can get what we might call something similar to postnatal depression, but whether it's postnatal depression exactly, does it really matter? What really matters is we get that support. So we actually did find that fathers were telling us once again they needed more information about why it was important to protect their mental health and the support that they get. They were reluctant to seek help, and partly because of the stigma, but even when they did seek that help, it wasn't there. And they also, like we saw in the previous study, they also found that health visitors, midwives, other health professionals in the perinatal period were not seeing them as a priority too. And that's not sort of taking anything away from the mother, but it was just that, well, you're just there, and not recognizing them as an integral part of that. And of course, that told us that we needed to train these health professionals a lot more, to recognize that fathers are also important and that they need support of their own mental health. Then, of course, there's this whole thing about the birth trauma, the witnessing of that. You know, let's not forget, the father is in that room when his partner is potentially getting into very serious trouble, and then he's removed from the room. And I get that, you know, they need to make sure that the mum's well and the baby's well, but he's removed from that room and not given any information, no support, no guidance of what he can do to support his own mental health and his partner's mental health and what have you. And it's not just about those dramatic sort of birth traumas, if you like. It's also about how suddenly the birthing plan might change, an unexpected cesarean, that sort of thing. So all of these things are really important. Now, we know this already with mums, but it's also true of dads, that there's plenty of focus on the physical health outcomes with a birth trauma. But for many mums, the mental health is not recognised as much as it could be. In fact, when their mood changes, sometime after she's given birth to the baby, often she's misdiagnosed as having postnatal depression when actually it's probably PTSD. And that's really important because the way in which we treat PTSD is very different to postnatal depression. And this is the same for fathers too. So we needed to know more about what we could do to support the fathers. I'm also very conscious of time, so I don't want to focus too much on mothers and birth trauma here. But as I said earlier, you know, the PTSD is an important factor here. And why this is important is that when we look at PTSD, it's not just about being involved in a traumatic event as if it happened to you. It's also about witnessing birth traumas. So is the same for witnessing birth trauma. Now, this is important for fathers because, as I say, they're witnessing a traumatic event. They suddenly have that sense of control taken away because all of a sudden they're out of the room. Everything's going completely different to plan. We know that a risk factor for anyone developing PTSD is when they've no longer got control over that situation. It's also if they're not given the right kind of information about what they've experienced and what they can do to address that. And it's also about the way in which people process the memory of what they've seen and their emotional reaction to that. Now, one of the things we do know is that men will cope with trauma very differently to the way women do. And that's important because sometimes women will use a positive coping mechanism. They try and get some sense of what's actually happened to them and therefore seek that help. Fathers and men, well, men and fathers can often use negative coping styles. This could be drinking, it could be taking drugs, it could be picking fights, but largely negative coping styles. And this is why it was important that we looked at that. What we found was yet again, fathers who were witnessing these events, they were recognizing as having an impact on their mental health, but there was no support for that at all. There was no information, there was no recognition, there was no support. And the fathers felt very unimportant at this stage. All of a sudden, his wife, his partner, was in serious trouble, and it was as if it didn't matter. You just get out of the room, dear. We'll sort out the mother and we'll let you know what's going on later. So they just simply were being excluded. So we knew that as well as the mothers needing more support, the fathers needed support, but we also needed to train the health professionals more about what we could do to help all partners during this kind of situation. Again, that work is published. If you want to read that online. Hello, Scott, can see you now. So we are actually getting some success here. As I said, recently, or until recently, there was no NHS support for fathers. Nothing at all. Go back 3, 4, 5 years, there was absolutely nothing at all. Then we were asked to submit this data about what we're doing, all those things that I've just been talking about, as did others across the country. Then, as I said earlier, in 2018, NHS England announced that fathers would now be screened for their mental health. Great. We were really, really happy about that. But is that enough? Well, let's think about that. Look at the statement again. Fathers will now be screened for their mental health. Where mothers are referred to perinatal mental health services. Well, not all mothers are referred because they're not, they might not be severely unwell enough. So fathers will get missed. We've already seen that fathers can develop postnatal mental health problems themselves, irrespective of the mother. The fathers then get picked up. The work that we did with birth trauma was completely overlooked. So fathers weren't getting support for the impact of birth trauma. And by definition, NHS England, it's only England. What about Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales? There wasn't any support for that too. So there's a lot that needs to be done. And any progress that we did do, throughout 2019 to try and upskill health visitors and the likes, and actually getting service in place got scuppered in 2020 when COVID came along and fathers were out the picture again. That's for another presentation. So we need more research and we need more campaigning. Very briefly, I want to mention International Fathers' Mental Health Day, and I hope Scott's going to be involved in that later on. We might hear about that. It's always the day after Father's Day. So this year it's June the 20th. We've been doing this for about 6 years ago. Mark Williams started it off, and I've been sort of co-hosting the UK side of things with Mark for the last 4 or 5 years, I guess. And largely it's about campaigns, it's about going online for interviews, it's about social media, it's about doing vlogs and blogs, Instagram live, all that sort of thing. This year also, Dad's Matter UK are doing a fabulous conference up in Bolton on that day, so look out for that. If you need more information, ask me, I'll send you the details. So what about the rest though? You know, it is important that we support fathers, absolutely, and I'm really pleased that we're able to do so more than we were before, even if there's more work to do. But one thing came up time and time again when I started presenting this, when I was going on the radio talking about this. People were saying to me, yeah, great fathers, what about all parents? What about all partners? You know, we need to think beyond the binary, the traditional values we have or descriptions we have for parents. We could be looking at lesbian partners. We could be looking at gay adoption. We could be looking at trans dads, and there's so much more. We're starting it already. We're actually at this moment in time undertaking some research with lesbian partners where one of the partners is the gestational mother. She gives birth, her partner, her wife, is in that room witnessing it. What are we going to find? I think probably very much the same as we found with fathers, and perhaps more so, because my perception is that a lesbian partner will be treated pretty much in the same way as the woman next door. You know, she's not emotionally engaged, or at least that's perception. And we need to know more about that kind of support too. So what else do we, and that's essentially it. I don't know how we were doing for time, because I've got no clocks in here, but I suspect that wasn't far off 20 minutes. And I'd like to try and take some questions. So I'm going to stop sharing so I can see you all and see all the screens. William, yeah, speaking as Blake, I hate the term baby blues. It's dismissive. I get that, but let's not forget, baby blues is very different to postnatal depression. Baby blues, most mums get. It's within, you know, the first few days after the baby's been born. Statistics suggest 75%, or I think it's nearer to practically all mums, in one way or another, get baby blues. And that will be, you know, sudden changes of emotion, questioning maternal skills, crying. You know, it's all about about hormones and all that sort of thing, but it tends to go away after a few days or so. We're not normally particularly worried about that. Postnatal depression is another thing altogether, and that's what we're kind of focusing on here.
You've got 2 questions in the Q&A. Okay. So the first one is from Mark Ghetto. It says, thank you for this important presentation, Andrew. As someone who has witnessed a birth trauma myself, I recently came to realize the lasting impact of my experience when being present for the birth of my second child.
Yeah.
This trauma has stayed with me, and I felt a clear sense of fear during the birthing phase, a time when I wanted to feel joy. Did any fathers in your study disclose the impact on witnessing a subsequent birth?
There only maybe a handful, because it really, you know, with any qualitative research, is only as good as the questions you ask in the first place. Interviewing might be different because you could probe, but it's a very good point. We do know that mothers are more likely to develop something called tocophobia, which is the fear of giving birth, because if there's been a birth trauma previously. So there's absolutely no reason why fathers won't feel the same way too and become very fearful. We need to do more research on that, and that has an impact on the entire family. I mean, all of my children are adults now. The youngest is 32, 33, and they're all parents themselves now. And some of them have had, three of my daughters, you know, they were pretty traumatic births. As a grandparent, I've got 9 grandchildren. As a grandparent, you then become fearful of your children giving birth. You become quite terrified of it yourself. So it is something that we need to look at more. Absolutely. And I hope you've got support, Mark, for that.
Thank you. He said, my thoughts are that it needs to be a little more purposeful rather than the birth reflections my partner and I have been offered as a general service. So kind of tailoring that and acknowledging that those issues are there. There's one more question, and I'm just going to say, can you tell us the research title of the study where a cause of the mother's postnatal depression is an unsupportive partner, please?
Oh, can they email me that? I don't know at the top of my head. It's almost certainly on one of my other slides. I wouldn't be at all surprised if it was Susan Paulby, but let me look into that. Can you make a note of that, please, Ernestine, and email it to me?
I will.
Today until early next week, but I'll pick this up next week. Okay,
I will. The person who's asked the question is come up as anonymous, so but I will get the question. We can send the answers together with slides and so on when it goes out. My email's on the slides, as is my social media. They can contact me. It'll be totally confidential, I promise. Oh, that's brilliant then. There's one more question, but I think if we let Scott present, then we have half an hour for open conversations and we can pick up all the other questions and just answer it as a panel, if that's okay. Absolutely fine. I won't stay around too much longer, but I'll try and pick up questions later. Thank you very much. Thank you. So we've had that privilege of listening to Andy present that powerful study. We're moving on to our last presenter of the day, which was strategically kind of timetable to be the last person who can facilitate conversation, the open discussions as well. So we've got Scott Myers, who will be talking about the importance of understanding paternal mental health and its impact on the family. So we've got Scott. I'm going to share, Scott, my screen for Scott's slides. Can you see it here?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
I'll bring it.
Okay, right. So as I introduced myself earlier on, my name is Scott Mayer. It's pretty much downhill. I'm afraid you've just listened to Andy, but I'm very fortunate. As much as I don't like to follow either Andy or Mark Williams, I heard Mark Williams, who's been mentioned already, talk about father's mental health a couple of years ago, and it changed my life. You know, I'm not going to undersell it. I'd experienced mental illness, mental ill health, however we want to address it, for quite a few years. My wife and I have 7 children. My eldest is 19, my youngest is 3. Pretty much every couple of years all the way down. And out of all of those deliveries, we had one Euroclass straightforward textbook delivery, no complications, mum and baby home the same day. In the rest of it, we had 3 complicated pregnancies and births, and then 3 very traumatic ones. And it was the last one where I almost lost my wife and my son. But at one point, I actually said goodbye to my wife. Thankfully, she pulled through. She's here. She was very unwell post C-section, and everything that Andy's just described is what I lived, unfortunately. And it's why I try and do this. For 3 days after my youngest was born, my wife deteriorated and she really wasn't very well. We've been together since we were 16, you know, first day of college. We've been together ever since. We're 40 this year. And, you know, it wasn't coming from a place of arrogance, but I knew this person better than anybody else in the world. And I was just trying to express that something was massively wrong. And they didn't listen, you know, and you can have your spin on why you think that happened, man, in that world. Because I was a father, I couldn't possibly understand what my wife had been through I had all of this thrown at me, and that I just didn't understand the situation. And as I stood there saying goodbye to the love of my life, you know, I snapped. I snapped in a way that I don't think I ever recover from. And when I talk about the fact that I know for a fact I went through therapy, I was fortunate, you know, I've been diagnosed with PTSD as a result of this. I'm an ex-infantry soldier. You know, when I talk to people about the fact that I've got PTSD and I have to manage my mental health, everybody gives you that sort of sympathetic but appreciation for your service nod. When you sort of take it back from them and say, well, it's actually not from my service, you know, the most scared I've ever been in my whole entire life was in a delivery suite when it goes wrong. And everything that Andy's just described, and when that cord is pulled, when the room fills full of people, and you just get pushed further and further to the back of the room, and you don't always understand what's going on. You know, I was in that situation twice. Neither of them were particularly any different, even though I'd been through it the first time. The second time, it was just as probably, if not more, traumatic. And in that sort of moment, my son was took down to the neonatal unit, and this is why I'm not here to say we need to take the focus off moms, like Andy says. You know, it's finding space around it for whatever that partner is. You know, whatever that other half of the family is, we have to find time and space for them. And it doesn't always happen in the moment, in the problem. You know, when things are traumatic, you know, you need to address it, but they don't always have time to say, this is what's happening, this is why we have to go to theatre. But they have to start finding time afterwards to explain what happened and why, so you can help to process it and move forward. And that's what I hear. I run support groups around the country, and where I live in Warwickshire, WhatsApp groups, walk and talks, you know, bit stereotypical. We do meet at the pub once a month, and the dads will come, new dads, they come from different antenatal educators, and some come from the hospital. And unfortunately, the people that are paying for private antenatal education are much more prepared for parenting. And, you know, I'm not saying that we don't still have difficult journeys to get there, but we're a little bit more prepared for it. Yes, you can't be aware that everything's going to happen, and you can't be prepared for every situation. But it's about giving parents the information that what is going to happen isn't what we see in the movies, it isn't what we see on Instagram, you know, and it can go wrong. And these are the things to be aware of. And the neonatal unit was one of them. You know, I've been through maternity services 6 times. I thought I was prepared for everything. Neonatal unit was a different world. You know, not being able to pick my son up, not being able to help him, not being able to kiss him, cuddle him. You know, I'd done skin to skin with all of my children. This was my youngest. I couldn't even hold him. I couldn't touch him. My wife was fighting for her life upstairs. And I was met by the neonatal teams with, you know, we need to get permission from your wife before we can discuss what's happening. So I remember sat outside the neonatal unit. My wife at the point wasn't very well, but we thought she was okay. And my son, I knew really wasn't very well because he couldn't breathe by himself. And I didn't know if he was going to survive. And I'm just left sort of sat in the corridor for a bit. So in that 15 minutes, my whole world fell apart. I was going to lose my wife. I was going to lose my son. How do I go home and tell my other children that I went to a hospital to bring 2 of them home and I'm coming home by myself? You know, how do I, if my wife doesn't make it and my son does, how do I tell him what happened? How do I not attribute his birth to his mum being taken away from the rest of the family? How do I prevent my children resenting him for that? And if I'm brutally honest, how do I prevent myself from resenting him for the fact that he took her away from me? And with all this going on, not one person asked if I was okay. Not one person said, you know, do you need to talk? Do you want a cup of tea? You know, so you experience all of this. You get in the car and you go home and you carry on with your life. You know, the most traumatic thing you're ever going to witness in your life happening to the people that mean the most to you. That's why, you know, I want to do that. I want to try and raise awareness in this presentation. I've tied in some of this that maybe might not be relevant, but, you know, I did some training with the police, and it was sort of looking at mental health in the police, because when it comes to mental health, when it comes to the other end that we'll talk about later on in terms of how men and fathers can present, when we look at the fact that they can sometimes become violent, you know, the police are going to be picking this up. So it's education everybody needs to have and understand that not necessarily what people are doing, but why they're doing it and what's happening in their life when they're experiencing it. And, you know, I thought it was very interesting to look at the police, but we'll look at the statistics. So if you go to the next slide, please, Ernestine. So this I've pretty much touched on. You know, it's a little bit about me and why I do it. I probably went into a little bit more detail, so we'll skip past that one, please. So yeah, this is one of the slides that it might not be relevant, but I thought it was interesting. And when we look at this, 5% of fathers will experience PTSD following the birth of a child. This is research that I've found. There's not an awful lot of it, and they say 15% of mothers. But what that brought down to, when I also looked at it, is 1 in 5 police officers will suffer from PTSD from something they will witness in their job. It's a high stressful job. They witness things that most people probably don't. And it all takes an impact. My understanding of mental health was quite ignorant until probably 5-6 years ago, when I probably started to study my enemy a little bit better and try and understand what I was experiencing. And I'd always looked at it before, that if you were experiencing depression or you were struggling, and for whatever reason, it was something that had just happened in your life that had caused that to happen. And obviously sometimes it is. And when it comes to PTSD and trauma, it obviously is most of the time. But when I started to understand it, was more that domino effect. It was how your life has been. And I was fortunate. I went through therapy to understand this. And when you look at jobs like the police, when I speak to men in the police, it's predominantly men. They're predominantly in that father age. There's a lot of fathers and new fathers in and around policing. And there's so much going on that when you look at, there's probably 5 different types of research or pieces of research that have come out in the last 18 months, 2 years, that up to 90% of fathers saying they weren't even asked about their mental health at any point. But then we look at the statistics that have already been addressed today, that they say 1 in 10 fathers will experience what we call postnatal depression. Now, we've touched on it today. Paternal depression is the terminology that a lot of people are quite happy. I don't care what you call it. I really don't care what you call it. But you have to address it as it's being part of the perinatal period. You have to connect it back to the root and the cause of what happens. And this is where it could become quite clouded for people that do have probably more exposure to trauma and see things on a basis that does take its toll. You can compartmentalize so much of it. I say that as a former soldier. And then all of a sudden, when something happens that impacts you in a different way because it happens to the people that you love, it opens Pandora's box. And I felt myself, when I was first really struggling, dealing with things that I hadn't thought about in years, it just seemed to open up everything that ever happened to me. And one of the reasons that I really do try and talk about this, I'm not looking for sympathy. That's not why I'm here. But if it wasn't for my wife, I would not be sat here. I know that for a fact. That's how bad it was. I didn't think there was a way out. We talk about men not talking. I spoke to everybody, but they didn't hear what I said. They didn't understand what I was experiencing. And what happens then is, if you're a father experiencing perinatal mental health in that period, in that sort of 2 years surrounding the birth, if you're struggling in that time and you can't connect it to the birth, the trauma, the transition, which we undersell to all parents every day, hardest thing they're ever going to do in their whole entire life, and we just don't prepare them for it. It's absolutely dreadful, really, when you think about it. But we don't offer that support, but we don't offer the guidance. Everybody in society is duty bound to educate the next generation of parents what real life parenting looks like, what the real world is, not what they see and what is presented on social media and in the movies and in television, but how difficult parenting is, and the fact that we all find it hard. We all find that transition difficult, and we find parenting hard at some point. I always say, if you find parenting easy all of the time, you're doing it wrong. And that's one of the things that you have to sort of try and break down with parents. And police, the other thing that we found that Andy's talked on, which I thought is relevant, is guilt. The police, men and women, they really do struggle with that guilt of the hours, the demand, the fact that their children often feel that the job comes first and other people's children are more important than their own. So there's lots of things going on, and they hear this story. It can be quite a toxic environment at times. And it's just hard to look past what we see and what we present from society. But I just thought it was interesting. So if we could move on to the next one, please. Right, so yeah, again, 2016 pay morale survey also revealed that 69.4% of police officers who were actively looking to leave the police force wanted to do so because of the impact on their mental health and well-being. So when we looked at this research, and the police officers, obviously, that I've spoken to since, I work quite closely with a small charity called Blue Minds, which has been set up to create mental health awareness and support in general, but looking at paternal and maternal mental health and that transition back into being a police officer after maternity leave originally, but now starting to look at the impact on fathers as well. So they're starting to look at the fact that, they just don't feel the demand in general on their mental health in the police force is quite massive from what they do. and they're looking to leave, and I think that's why we've seen the reduction in numbers. So move on, we'll carry on with the slide, the presentation. Sorry. This one actually is the one that probably shocked me the most when I did this and looked into this research and compiled a little report, and it was 73% of managers or above in certain industries, one including the police, didn't know how to support a colleague if they were explaining that they had mental health or they were struggling with their mental health. And when we sort of tie that to the fact that we've heard it mentioned today, that that particularly as a new father, you're just straight back into work. There's no real decompression. There's no real discuss about what happened. And in the support groups that I work with, quite a lot of fathers I speak to mention something that's already been touched on today, is if their child's maybe been unwell or their wife's been unwell, they've only had 14 days. They can quite easily lose 3, 4, 5, up to 7 of those days. I mean, I've even spoken to fathers that literally the baby came home on day 10 and they're back to work on day 14. So when we talk about that bond and attachment, it's very difficult to do that anyway in 2 weeks, but it's almost impossible to do it in 4 days. So then, that they do distance themselves. And one thing that I have noticed that was asked earlier on was this throwing themselves into work. I've worked with quite a lot of fathers that have done that. And the main reason when you sit and you unpick it and you break it down is they don't understand their role at home. They don't understand what they're supposed to do. And the easiest way to do that is to throw themselves into work because they can control that a little bit. The other two sides of it that I've seen with the fathers that I've worked with is, one, if their partner is experiencing mental illness, but not predominant. When we look at sort of psychosis, obviously that's the more extreme end, but even if it's postnatal depression or severe anxiety, but when there's that change, and we hear it, Andy touched on it a minute ago, that I don't recognize this person, I don't know who I'm living with, this isn't the person that I knew before we had children. And they maybe don't like it, they maybe don't like them, which is quite a difficult conversation to have. So they don't want to be in that environment, but so they just go to work. And it's easy to excuse it then because I'm working extra because I've got a child. It's easy to disguise it. And then there's the other side, which is what we're sort of programmed to be the provider. We're the man, we're supposed to provide, we're the breadwinner, which we know is not true. I mean, things are changing. There's women in parliament, there's women CEOs. There's quite a lot of guys that I work with that are now looking at staying at home dads, because they can be home based a little bit more because of the hybrid working, So things are shifting and they are changing, but there is still this society view that the man has to provide. And when it's, what do you do with your children? When they're not taught how to bond and sing and dance and play and cuddle and watch the baby sleep and listen to the cry so they know what baby needs, and that's how their confidence grows. When nobody explains that, what they do as a father is they just earn more money so the child doesn't want for anything. And they don't see that's anything wrong. And I'm not going to sit here and say it is, but nobody's gave them the extra alternative or what they could do to better spend time with their child rather than just earning money. But nobody sits and explains that. But then they're a distant father. They're a workaholic father who doesn't want to be at home and doesn't help you. But nobody's actually sat down and explained, that you've got to maybe try and find this balance. You can't have it all. We live in a life, particularly because of Instagram and stuff, where we think we can have it all. And I think as any parent, you can't have it all. You can't have everything that you want, and the job and the career and the time on your own and the family, and keep everything perfect. It doesn't work like that. So that it's trying to learn how to navigate our own path into parenting, particularly as a father. And I have a sort of slogan that I use all the time, and it's be the father that you want to be, not the one that society tells you to be. And I do genuinely believe that, because so many fathers that I work with, and I was one of them, that in your house, you will present yourself as a certain way with your children. When you go outside, you present a different way, and you maybe won't have conversations. And that's because that's how society's made them feel. I speak to fathers every week that go to take their child for their injections. And have you got permission from mum? Have you got permission to be here? And they go to register the birth and they can't register the birth without mum. They try and take the baby to the doctors. If it's the first appointment, it has to go to the mum's doctors. And they're just constantly kept at arm's length and then blamed for being there. And I think that's where society is starting to change massively. So next slide, please. Right, so 86% of men, there's lots of surveys doing this, saying that they felt depressed at some point in the 5-year point from conception. And what we find, that there's sort of like this perfect window that, Andy will probably touch on this if he's still here. If not, just try and do it on my own. But we have this perfect window of sort of 3 to 6 months. And that sort of after baby's born, that's when we see dads, and maybe if they're experiencing depression, it can come out in that sort of window. And my understanding, I could be absolutely wrong, but this is the way that I see it. And I do believe that I'm right, is that 3 to 6 month period with the fathers that I've spoken to in the last few years, that's where things start to go back to normal. So that's when things have started to settle. Mums maybe start to feel a little bit better. Baby's in a bit of a routine. Even if they've got siblings in the house already, everything's starting to settle a little bit. Mum's feeling a little bit better. You've had that massive influx of all the family, that's now all gone. And that's when you start to, okay, everything's gone back to normal, but I haven't. I don't know what this is, but I know I don't feel like I did before. And it could be they're fully aware of what they're experiencing, but more often than not, with the fathers that we work with, they're not, until it's sort of pointed out and explained, because society will tell them that they don't experience it, as we've just touched on with Andy's presentation. So it is very difficult to help them understand it. So then it can take up to 2 years before they present to anybody from a professional capacity. So I mean, it does take that lot longer, but in that period, so many fathers will say they'll have spells of depression, but it's that 3 to 6 months when you start to realize that something is not quite right, and it takes time then to build up to engaging with services. And yet again, that is put on the father. He doesn't engage with services, but unfortunately, as we've proven today, we have a system of services that don't engage with them, and what we've got to try and do is not put the onus on one side or the other. We've got to meet in the middle, and I touched on it earlier on that we now have hybrid working. We have got access to both parents like we've never had before. And I don't really see it changing back to the way it was. It can't, I don't think. So there is that access. We have technology. We have Zoom like today. We can have video calls. So when they are going to appointments and scans, but that can be there, even if it's just for a few minutes, to ask a question, have some concerns, and the other thing that we sort of looked at, and I've found this with lots of fathers and my own experiences again, is it's not real as a pregnancy for most fathers until they hear that heartbeat. When they go to the scan and you hear that heartbeat, then it's this go time to go to work. But up until that point, that connection's not there. And sometimes it is for mum, but not always. But because of COVID and because in certain areas we've had different restrictions, I've dealt with quite a lot of fathers that didn't go to any scan. So they've not been able to get on board with the pregnancy. It's not felt completely real. They've felt completely alienated. Then somebody hands them a baby and they've got to know what to do. And then all of a sudden, that bond isn't there. And the thing that they don't understand is that bond's never there straight away. It's very, very difficult for that bond to be there, because the reason for that is, to baby, you're a stranger. As dad, baby doesn't know you yet. One of the things that we talk on is ways to sing and talk and read the sports pages, read letters, read texts, whatever it is, to the baby in the bumps. It gets used to the tones of your voice. Don't just sing nursery rhymes, because we're not all Mary Poppins. We don't walk around singing nursery rhymes all day. So it's trying to use a language that can calm baby, that you will use every day. Now, you can do that every single day, and it might not make the blindest bit of difference, because baby knows mum, sounds, smells, heartbeats. That's safe. That's a good place to be. So they're a little bit resistant to dad, and then dad will be a little bit resistant to them. And all of a sudden, you've got a baby that cries when dad holds it, goes back to mum, stops crying. All of a sudden, dad says, my baby hates me, because he doesn't understand that relationship needs to build. It needs to nurture. It takes time. It's not instant. So they've not been part of the pregnancy. Everybody's blaming everything on COVID. And I'm not saying that this is wrong. So they're hearing all this negativity. So new fathers that I'm talking to now, they feel disadvantaged because of COVID, rather than trying to look at the fact that, the people that have done it in the last 2 years, and even people that are maybe doing it now, you are home a little bit more. There's so much positive. You have got more access to these appointments. We've just got to, like I said, try and meet in the middle. And that's the bit that I'm trying to be, that bit in the middle, to connect it, because I think that's the only way to do it. It's not one person. It's society's got to change the way that it sees men and fathers. And there's a lot of positives. And I think we've just got to champion the positives rather than focusing on the negatives of what COVID has exposed. And unfortunately, what COVID has exposed is a problem that's been there for a very long time. None of my children were born during COVID, but I've experienced just about everything that the dads have expressed to me. In terms, the only difference was I was there. So I was present, but we never had a presence. That presence has never been there. They sort of let them into the maternity room, and that's almost where it stopped. The obligation to help and support and understand. And like Andy said, the birth plan, we have a terminology in the army that no plan survives first contact. That is a birth plan. From our experience of doing it 7 times, and for the families that I work with, very rarely goes how we think we're going to go. And the only sort of perfect birth is the one that you've not had yet. And I think the only perfect parents are the ones that haven't become parents yet, because it's very different what we think it's going to be and what it actually is. And the higher that expectation is raised by society, the more difficult it is to deal with the fact that we find it hard. And I think that guilt that we've touched on quite a lot today is crippling for parents. And this 5-year window, I think the other thing we're going to see, Andy's touched on tocophobia, without a doubt. Fathers are absolutely traumatized to ever go back to the maternity unit because they've experienced dreadful things. I've worked with fathers that have had baby loss and they were sat in the car park. So now that their partner's lost a baby, they weren't there to be able to support them. The partner is resentful that she went through that on her own and he wasn't there. We're looking, relationships are breaking down. Families are actually really being massively impacted, that we don't know the full result of what's happened in terms of mental health from COVID. We won't know it for a few years, but there is a massive impact when it comes to the next pregnancy. And I know fathers that have said there won't be any more. There's absolutely no way, because everybody 5 years ago would have guaranteed me what happened in the last 2 years couldn't happen, because it just couldn't. There's no way you wouldn't be at the birth or go to appointments or go to scans. If you want to be there, you will be there. There's no way if your partner gets an induction that won't be able to be there. Or if you catch a flu or a virus or whatever, then you can't be at the hospital. Nobody would have believed that could happen, and it did. So their worst case scenario, or our worst case scenario, has become their reality. So the fear of going through that again is preventing families from growing, and that's absolutely heartbreaking. Next slide, please. Again, we touched on this very briefly. 90% of fathers polled in multiple research. Myself and Mark Williams are actually conducting a survey at the moment into the father's experience in the perinatal period, but also from a healthcare professional's point of view and what they would like to see or how they can support. And the one thing I touch on quite a lot is I can't blame the healthcare professionals for not asking or not trying to help or screen from a mental health point of view for fathers, because they don't have the pathways if the father is struggling. So you can almost excuse the question not being asked. It's the system that's failing the healthcare professionals. It's not the healthcare professionals' fault. They can only deal with the tools that they've got. But when you look at 90% of fathers in so many polls, and it's 85% in, I think, the 200 and odd dads that have done the one that Mark and I have done, that have said they weren't asked, and sort of 90% saying they've experienced some form of change in their mental health, and nobody actually asked them about it. So that 1 in 10 dads that have postnatal depression is only based on 10% that are asked. So when people ask me, do I think 1 in 10 is accurate? I think statistics are very hard to be accurate anyway, particularly when it comes to mental health, because it is based on people that are engaging the services. And statistically and very sexist point of view, men don't predominantly do that. So it is much higher. There's new research coming out of Canada that says 1 in 4 will experience some form of mental illness or depression or anxiety in that sort of what they call the postpartum period. And what we've sort of looked at is that's probably slightly more accurate, I think. But I'm a firm believer, and Andy touched on it, every parent's mental health is impacted when they become a parent, because that transition's so huge and there is a change in the relationship. And that's one thing that fathers are not prepared for. And I experienced it, is this jealousy of, what did I get out of this? Because she's focused on the baby doesn't want to be with me, it wants to be with her. And all of a sudden I'm on the outside. Everybody that we've dealt with from a professional point of view, that's where they made me feel that I should be on the outside. And then as time goes by, all of a sudden you're a distant deadbeat dad that doesn't want to engage, and nobody's ever really gave you the tools to engage. So it's it is a double standard, but it's also very unfair. It's a bit like letting your children do something and then grounding them for doing it. And I think that's a lot what we've done with fathers for far too long now. So next slide, please. Yeah, so 26% of dads, so we could say sort of 1 in 4 again. That sort of 3 to 6 month period we talked about, that sort of window, that is definitely where most fathers that I speak to, it's not always as quick. Sometimes with mothers, it is a bit quicker, but with fathers it can take time. And I think that is the pushing it down, override, keep going, be the strong, be the one that's got to sort of be the rock of the family we heard discussed earlier on. That's definitely what's the experiencing. But there's only so long you can do that. And when you add all the different problems and complications, the only good thing that I have seen a decrease from COVID is that you have cultural again, and the perinatal training company that I work for, that we do train. And what we have noticed, we do cultural training, and there has been sort of a bit of a shift in certain aspects of society, that this overpowering in-laws have not had the same access they've had before, because they're not able to be there, because they weren't, because of restrictions. So parents had that little bit more time on their own. And when I speak to sort of expectant parents, I always say that that first 2 weeks is the golden 2 weeks to start the foundations of what your parenting life is going to be like, you know, and how your family is going to develop. And it's really important that you spend the right amount of time getting to know each other as parents and getting to know the child. And if you could shut the world out for the first 7 days, I wish you could. And COVID has given that a little bit, which is another positive that we don't focus on. Is that, you know, there is that positive side of it, that families have had that little bit more time to do things in their own way. Yes, they've been isolated, and yes, that has caused problems, but there is some pluses as well. And not having that mother-in-law that takes the baby off the dad every time he's too slow changing the nappy, you know, it gave them time to be a little bit more involved and learn things at their own pace. And fathers that have had babies in COVID and babies previously, even if they're like teenagers and they're now having a new baby during COVID, they've talked about the difference of being at home, even if they're working from home, just having their lunch with the kids or not having that commuting time. This, you know, the benefits and that bond is so much better. The problem for that is we now have dad guilt, because we've got dads going back into the workplace at a rate that we've never had before. You know, mums have experienced this for a very long time, but so many dads I speak to, they're miserable because they're not sort of at home. They're back in the office. They enjoy being at home with a little one, you know, particularly if they've got other kids to relate it to. And they're now in that place where I'm not as good a father as I was 3 months ago, and I'm not as good as my job as I was, and I'm going to lose my job. And all of a sudden, you know, they're building more and more anxiety. And then we live in a society that believes that our home stress and our work stress are two different things. You know, they're not. They absolutely morph in together. And COVID has proved that, because we lived at work and we work where we live. You know, it's been very, very difficult for people to do, you know, but things have changed and life has an impact. And if a dad has a sick child, you know, his workplace wouldn't be accepting. If he was maybe struggling or wanted the day off, it would almost be frowned upon if the mum didn't, you know, and that's where the double sort of standard is a little bit. So we are trying to change that, I think, as a society, but the problem is we want it all too quickly. You know, we're trying to change too much all at once, and it can be a little bit overwhelming for a lot of dads that I've spoken to, because all of a sudden everybody wants to engage and they're using language and terminologies that they've never heard before. And it's all coming a little bit too quick, and that can be a little bit overwhelming. And one thing that a lot of research has shown, including the fathers that I work with, is drip feeding this change in information to fathers and engaging them from the very booking appointment of the pregnancy, and just little bits just to keep them involved in the process and be aware of what's going on and how they can be more supportive of what their partner's going through. That's the way that we do it. And that doesn't take long. I hear we haven't got time. You need a couple of minutes for a dad to write some questions and send it in with his wife, and you answer them and send them back. You know, there's ways in which we can do it. We can, like I said, we can do Zoom. There's ways that we can contact the fathers and have them involved now that we didn't have before. And I'm conscious of time, so skip, please. This one, and then I think because we're short on time, I'll finish on this one then. This is something that I touched on in terms of my wife earlier on, that 50% of they will say that if the partner has postnatal depression or the wife has postnatal depression, then the dad or the partner will experience it too. But we don't talk about the fact that that goes the other way, you know. And this is the thing where I think we don't support fathers enough in terms of their mental health and how to support their partner. We definitely don't support the partner on how they can support their husband. And if it wasn't for my wife and it wasn't for the fact that she didn't give up on me when I did, I wouldn't be here. You know, it really was. I didn't know what else to do. I didn't know where else to turn. It was absolutely desperate. There really wasn't the support and access, and it wasn't easy to get to. And there's lots of other things going on. Lots of fathers that I speak to will sort of express the same, but I know that impacted on my wife. I know for a fact it did. Supporting me, I know how hard that was to watch, because she told me, you know, 6 months later, I was doing something in the kitchen and she smiled at me, and it was a very nice smile that I don't get very often. And I said, "What's wrong?" And she said, "I didn't think I'd see this version of you ever again. I thought he was gone." So I know that massive impact. And the other thing that because we don't teach how to support, how we individualize parents all the time rather than bringing them together. And I think if we did, we could save a lot of relationships. We could have less adverse childhood experiences from family breakdowns on children if we just taught parents what each other was going through and taught them the art of talking about it and being open We're not looking for massive changes. We just want people to speak, and they will. They just don't always know the things they can talk about. So thank you very much. I am very good at making a short story long. I'll give Ernestine all the rest of the slides for anybody that wants them. There's a few more. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Scott. Your experience, your life experience, how the way you explained your life experience and the way you build it back into the work that you're doing and raising awareness of how important it is incredible. I don't think I could narrate such a story and still be composed, because I think it was hard for me and some of the audience from the chat. It was hard to listen, and so good to hear that you turning all that into positives in terms of supporting others and raising awareness. Thank you so much. We've got 3 questions in the Q&A, and also I was wondering whether I should just enable the audience, I should enable them to be able to talk rather than just typing, because now is open discussion till the end. So what the panel, what do you think? Should I
open it up? Open it up.
Okay.
Yeah, that's fine with me.
Right, I'm going to so I'm just going to enable everyone, and then right, so everybody should be able to speak now if they want to. So I'm just going to start with one of the questions that we've got in the Q&A. This question came up when Andy was presenting. Unfortunately, Andy had to go because he's dealing with some emergencies at home. But the question was, what can we learn about effective coping strategies from essentially mentally healthy dads, not i.e. that is not depressed? I wondered whether, Scott, you'll be able, because your presentation and things you're talking about, I wondered whether you might be able to contribute to this question.
Yeah, I'm really sorry. Can you say the question again? Because you broke up.
I'll read it again. It says, what can we learn about effective coping strategies from essentially mentally healthy dads?
Okay, right. Well,
That's a really interesting question.
Yeah. What I will say is, I'm still here. The advice that I give is that we've got to go back to the drawing board as such. We've got to go back to school to make the big changes. Unfortunately, we need to speak to boys. You know, I talk a lot about antenatal. We need to go back to children to have these discussions. But what we do find in the groups, you know, when we sit and talk to the dads that have maybe been through it, if you've experienced mental illness or mental ill health, you know, you never get over it. You know, we talk about recovery all the time. Recovery is just from your lowest point for the rest of your life. You know, you never really get past it. You learn how to cope with it. You learn how to manage it and see the warning signs. You maybe still have bad days. Just by having that conversation with someone that's struggling can change how they see things very, very quickly. And what we've also found is that a lot of what I touched on earlier on, you know, the guilt, this view on, particularly in fathers, you know, what a man is supposed to be. And unfortunately, in quite a lot of parts of society, that's still based on a very old model. That's based on Sean Connery. You know, that's what some people still think a man, a gentleman is supposed to be, and the way they are and the way they interact with their father. And anything that they do that's not sort of on that level is wrong. And that's what a lot of fathers struggle with. And we talk about modern parents, or we talk about modern fathers anyway, quite a lot. I don't like that terminology. They're not modern. We've always had this type of father. You can go back through every generation. There's been fathers that were probably different to the norm, that maybe did be more hands-on or have a different, more loving, more affectionate, more cuddly, stay on. God, John Lennon stayed at home for the first 5 years of his son's life in the late 70s, you know? So, I mean, we've always had these fathers. It's just more acceptable now. And I think that's why we have this pivoting point where we can change how we see the role of a father forever. because of what COVID has given us in terms of the access to them. So when you do put them in a group, what we've found with fathers is coming in person is very, very hard. Going face to face to admit that you're a man or you're a father, you're struggling, you were affected by the birth because you think you shouldn't be because it didn't happen to you. When they've got to go in person, it's very difficult. When they can go on Zoom, and Zoom sort of chats have been incredible for support groups for men and for fathers, that camera's off. So you're in the room, but you're not actually in the room. And what we find is the fathers that are maybe able to talk a little bit more, that maybe the facilitators, by just sharing a little bit about how they've found it difficult, how hard the birth was, how the fact that they maybe can't quite connect to the baby a little bit, and now they just feel like they're not enjoying it, and it's not what they thought it was going to be, and they find it really hard. All of a sudden, the cameras, boom, 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 they come on. And it'll just because something has resonated with that guy to think, Jesus, I'm not the only one. I'm not the only guy that feels like that. I'm not a terrible father. I'm not a terrible man. And the other thing that is really important, and I never got a chance to touch on it because I talked too much, and I'm doing it again, that when you see the slides, when we look at the signs and symptoms, there's lots of things that we look at. And violence and sort of libido and sex is two things that we talk about quite a lot. And these are the things that come up in conversations with fathers when they're ready to open up. And what we see the difference between anger and violence, lots of new dads think they're the same thing. So when you talk about anger or tendencies to maybe get a little bit more aggressive, they think that means they're being violent towards the child or the baby. When you break that down and say, no, it's this frustration, it comes from fear. It comes from fear of not understanding the process and being kept at arm's length and then supposed to have all the answers. And I speak to fathers who said that nobody spoke to me all the way through the pregnancy. And then my wife was unresponsive and my son was in the neonatal unit and I had to make decisions. The first conversation anybody ever had with me was, am I going to focus on my wife or focus on the baby? Or am I going to be okay with them to try something on the baby that nobody's ever had this conversation with me and you expect me to have the answers. And that's been really, really difficult for them to process. So the more they hear other fathers say, well, I went through similar and I understand it. So the ones that have maybe got a more of a handle on their mental health and their emotions can definitely have a massive, massive impact on just letting the other guys know that men can hurt, men can feel, men can cry, men can be parents, daddies can cuddle babies and kiss them and tell them they love them, and that's okay.
Can I add in on that question? Yeah, you're muted, Ernestine, but I'll also add in with what Scott has said. I like from a psychology angle, I do a lot of developmental psychopathology, and so what that question says to me is, can typical development inform atypical development? So if you look at it like, what's missing in the people that have developed that postnatal depression. So I do think it's an interesting question. I think it could be fleshed out a little bit more and potentially get some answers. But I see William has his hand up. So.
Yeah, thanks. William, please.
Yeah, all I wanted to say is that my dad worked shift work as a firefighter in the 70s and 80s, and that enabled him to be home a lot of the time. So he worked himself up to station commander, and so he did do some of the childcare as I was growing up, and I think that's helped me as like him being a role model with that. And yeah, that's just how I think it is, and the fact that it's like they're in dad's mental health. I think there's a definite dividing line between like people who can afford to go to pay for like stuff like NCT classes, because they prepare you. If you go with your wife to the NCT class, that very much more prepares you for the what happens in the delivery room and for what happens in the first couple of days afterwards, and gives the fathers a lot more context for what's happening, so they're able to assimilate what's happening much more easily. I know it definitely helped me. That there was a moment where Helena, my daughter, they lost her heartbeat, so suddenly the room filled with like 20 people. But because we'd kind of rehearsed what happens if there was an emergency in the NCT session, in one of the NCT sessions, I knew that there was a reason each person was there and kind of what their purpose was. So I didn't feel like kind of completely overwhelmed. Fortunately, that they then picked up Helena's heartbeat, so nothing further needed to happen. But it's so everybody then trooped out again. But it was yeah, that was a scary moment.
Thank you so much, William. I think that says a lot and adds a lot into what Scott was saying, as well as what Andy was saying. Claudine, please, you've got your hand up.
Hello, yes. Thank you, everyone. All the speakers, you were absolutely amazing. It was wonderful to watch. And my favorite would be Scott, because I'm also in the military. I'm still serving, and I work with basically with soldiers to safeguard them and their families. So I would say the main kind of difficulty we normally have is to speak to male soldiers, because they really feel that they are not entitled to talk about emotions, which is more than just a societal problem. So, but that's not the point I wanted to raise. I wanted to talk about, you know, when we do look at father's mental health, and then how a choice about the birthing plan potentially changes. And that's kind of what I did as a expecting mum. So my ex-husband at the time, my husband, he had witnessed 2 traumatic deaths from, not deaths, sorry, births from previous partners. So we had a discussion around an elective C-section, which he had felt would be easier for him to cope with. So I know that would probably raise a lot of eyebrows, because at the end of the day, it's my body, our baby. But, you know, I had to consider his mental health and all these different choices to make. And consultants were saying to me, look, you're perfectly healthy, baby's healthy pregnancy. So it was really controversial to try, you know, to make the decision to then persuade them to have an elective C-section. So you can imagine, you know, some people's opinions potentially around me wasting the NHS's money, or how to kind of manipulate the nice guidelines to you know, persuade people for elective C-section. So it was really, you know, a lot of things to think about, and I did it. So we did manage an elective C-section. But then, you know, yes, I thought about Dad's mental health, but what about mine? Being at home, being from South Africa, so my family were all back in South Africa, not having ways to lift myself out of the bed to get to the baby. My body changing all of a sudden, being a female soldier to then being a mum, but then also being someone who can't move myself around the house, you know, trying to build up my strength again, the image around, you know, your body changing as a woman, and you kind of chose that by having an elective C-section. There was just so many things that then can also impact on me, and then Dad's back at work and I'm with the baby most of the time. So just kind of wanted to highlight that a little bit.
Can I just say, I just read an op-ed type article, Claudine, on why elective C-section should be given, and it's exactly for that reason, to prevent trauma, and how it's more about control and being in control. But yeah, it's really complicated than your situation where you're trying to prevent your partner trauma rather than your own trauma. So
yes, I was going to say, unfortunately we hadn't stayed together. So when Scott was talking about, you know, positive maybe mental health, and you know, going back to the drawing board really, and re-educating men or society. So for me, I'm now a solo parent, so I'm completely on my own with my little boy. Again, I have to consider things around my child's mental health. I have a 6-year-old boy, you know, so what is he missing out on by not having a father? You know, I go from being the nurturing, loving mum to then the kind of dad wrestling and going to martial arts with him and kicking the ball. So it's really hard to kind of consider all of the different things that a dad can bring when a dad isn't there. So I was going to just say to Scott, so what I have done is I've got my son a drama therapist, so he can talk about his anger, he can role play it, he can learn more about the fact that it's okay to have emotions. So in our house, there's never been anything said around boys don't cry, or anything like that, anything to do with that stigma that society kind of puts on people's brains. But again, that's only in the house that I can control. So there's still that concern that society at school or martial arts or somewhere else will enforce it.
I was just saying thanks to Claudine, because she said something which touches on what you said, Scott, which is about education, which is absolutely crucial. I also think that the society, starting from policymakers down to the society and everything, they really need to acknowledge that parenthood, for it to really work, and as we're talking about mental health and talking about support, for it to really work, both fathers and mothers need to be supported equally. There is a lot, like Claudine was saying, concentration on mothers will mean they don't do anything on fathers, but the mothers will have to deal with thinking about the fathers, as well as the fathers are wrapped in thinking about, so what's going on with the mothers and so on. The system just and the society just really need to come to a point where they look at it as one whole rather than separate. And in that way, I think the support will be much better. Just picking up on a question that William had put in the Q&A, saying, how's the preparation for dads to be advocates in the delivery room? Because he started by talking about his experience and the fact that he was able to advocate for his wife in the delivery room. But generally, how can men or how can dads advocate or prepare, or how's the preparation for dads to be advocated or to be advocates in the delivery room? Can dads be advocates? Yes, please.
Yeah. Yeah. So what I would say, and what sort of the work that I've done, we run antenatal classes at my local hospitals. And it was one of the first things I did a few years ago when I started talking about this, was that we need that antenatal class for dads. We need a way to educate them on how to be involved in the process, because we've waited for the professionals to engage with dads. And like I said, we've got to meet halfway. And one thing that I've found is that by addressing any sort of concerns from the very beginning of pregnancy and, writing it down, I talk about journaling quite a lot. I don't mean like Bridget Jones. For an ex-army lad to keep a journal is quite strange, but and that's where it came from. My concerns during the pregnancy, I would write them down. My wife would take them, and in fairness, they didn't always get answered. But when I do sit down, I say, look, it gets you into the process of asking the questions that you're concerned about. Yes, the response is nice, but the more that you feel you can ask, then when you do become in that environment, and ask the questions, and it doesn't matter what you've sort of met with, and it's sort of personalizing it a little bit when I speak to these dads, that this is your love of your life, this is your everything, this is your baby, you've got more vested interest than anybody else in the room, but you got to find a way to work together. And I think it's sometimes the only criticism I have is that, and I've probably done it myself, because of the fear and the lack of control and understanding, we sometimes maybe come across a little bit aggressive. And that shutdown, then, that relationship is broken between the healthcare professional and the father if he comes across in that manner. So it's just from the very beginning of the pregnancy, trying to be at the appointments. It's difficult during COVID, I understand that. And we did try video calls, but if you can't be there, write down your concerns, any way that you can be as involved, listen to the play with the baby, have conversations with your partner. And the more that they spark that conversation with the midwife, my husband asked this, eventually as the answers start to filter back, then it's not a case of we can't wait to be invited anymore. We just got to kick the door in a little bit.
Thank you so much, Scott. We've got 4 minutes to go, but we've got, I don't know if I'm saying your name correctly. If not, please forgive me. Is that Lloyd?
It's Lord.
Lord. Thank
Yeah.
you. Sorry
Thank
for
you.
getting it
No,
wrong.
no, it's cool. Thank you, everyone. I've had a really good day today. I just wanted to touch on a bit of what Scott has been talking about, really, and just very quickly. June 2020, we had a traumatic birth. My wife had an infection, which turned into sepsis. We were in all night and had a C-section the following morning. And she then was in hospital for 4 days with the baby recovering. And, you know, I completely understand that, you know, as dads, we don't get asked how we're doing. You know, nobody during that entire time, not during visits to midwives, you know, talking to health visitors afterwards, nobody asked me how I was doing. And you know, we're pretty resilient. You know, we just got on with it. And you know, but I think part of what drives me now at Mandad Media, and we publish a monthly magazine for dads and the men who care for children. You know, it's our mission to help educate and empower dads to, as Scott said, kind of put the door in a little bit. You know, I made sure I was there during appointments. I made sure I asked questions. You know, I went through all the paperwork. You know, the pregnancy book, the results, the red book that you get afterwards. You know, I'm literally cover to cover. I want to be in there. I want to know. I want to ask the relevant questions. And I've even taken the baby to appointments completely by myself. You know, her 12-month development check was me. There is not a single question that was asked that I couldn't answer. And I think that, you know, we need to try and help as many dads as possible to be in that position, so that they you know, they know what they're doing, they feel confident, they are asking the relevant questions, and they have all the answers. So it doesn't always have to be mum. And I think that benefits everybody, frankly.
Thank you, Lloyd. Brilliant.
That's a very good point. Thank you so much. That makes me remember my own experience. It was always my husband taking the girls. I was always somewhere else. But he had way more information about our girls than I did. And interestingly, he's got a very good relationship with my girls. They don't take him seriously for anything. They take me very seriously, and they play a lot with him. The dynamics is rather very interesting in my household. But very good points. At this point, I just want to say thank you to everybody, starting with Scott, Paige, Samantha, all of you that attended this research discussion event, that's how I would like to call it. Really appreciate it. Work will continue to go on, and like Professor Lynn Gabriel said at the very beginning, there will be more that we will be doing, and this research for us is just starting. We are just starting on this chapter of fathers, and there's so much that needs to be done. For people, I don't know, I can see and recognize a few names there, people that live in New York. So we've got the Fathers Support Group that is running here on campus, face-to-face. We've got the sessions running online on Thursdays, 7:30 to 8:30. I do sit there, and sometimes I feel a little bit odd, but sometimes there's a lot of learning. I sit there because just because I set it up, but what I am hearing is really informing and teaching me an awful lot of things I did not know. So just want to say thank you all so much for being here today and making this a success. Thank you all so much. The slides and the recordings will be made available to everyone once it's all ready, probably by the end of the week. So thank you all so much for being here, and have a, oh, it's 2 o'clock, so enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Goodbye.